In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
The multiverse is a tapestry of infinite realities, each governed by laws older than thought itself. But beneath the tapestry, in the spaces between the threads, in the void where mathematics breaks and geometry screams, there dwell things that were never meant to touch the light of any sun. The warp is not the deepest darkness. Chaos is not the oldest hunger. And in the 41st millennium, as the Great Rift tears the galaxy in half, humanity is about to learn that their gods are children playing with matches in a universe that contains things far, far worse than demons. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The research station designated Terminus Sigma 17 had existed for 3 centuries on the ragged edge of the Great Rift, a monument to Imperial stubbornness and Mechanicus curiosity. Built into the corpse of a dead moon, its auger arrays reached into the screaming madness of the Cicatrix Maledictum like fingers probing a wound. Magos Explorator Val 7 had spent 92 years studying the rift's fluctuations, cataloging warp storms, tracking demon incursions, measuring the immaterial bleeding into the real. None of his data had prepared him for this. Impossible, Val 7 whispered through his Vox speakers, his 17 optical sensors fixed on the hololithic display. The readings they contradict fundamental principles. The display showed the Great Rift as expected, a massive tear in reality where the warp vomited into real space purple and crimson storms of psychic energy spanning light years. But now, at a specific coordinate deep within the rift's heart, something else appeared. A darkness that wasn't warp taint, a void that registered on none of their conventional sensors, but screamed its presence through instruments the Mechanicus had built for measuring things that shouldn't exist. Magos, one of his tech acolytes, reported, biological fear creeping through cybernetic calm. The dimensional resonance scanners they're detecting spaces that don't align with material reality or the Immaterium. Specify, Val 7 demanded. Neither, Magos. The readings suggest a third state, something adjacent to both, but belonging to neither. The mathematical models are returning non-Euclidean geometries that exceed our processing capacity. Val 7's primary cognition core churned through the data. The Mechanicus understood 2 states of existence: the Materium, physical reality governed by natural laws, and the Immaterium, the psychic dimension of emotion and thought that demons called home. Humanity had fought a 10,000-year war against chaos pouring from the warp. They knew that enemy. They had rituals, prayers, gray nights, and Geller fields. This was something else. The darkness on his sensors wasn't expanding through space. It was bleeding between spaces, occupying dimensions that intersected with reality at angles that hurt to calculate. His most sophisticated cogitators began producing error messages written in languages that hadn't existed when they were programmed. Magos, the astropathic choir is reporting disturbances, another acolyte said, voice tight with poorly suppressed panic. They say the warp is retreating from that location. Val 7's internal chronometer marked the moment. The warp, retreating, chaos, afraid. That alone was heresy to suggest, but the data did not lie. Where this new darkness appeared, the roiling madness of the Great Rift pulled back like skin recoiling from acid. Begin deep frequency scans, he commanded. I want gravitic, temporal, and quantum measurements on that anomaly. Alert the nearest inquisitorial presence. This requires... The lights died. Not flickered, not dimmed. Simply ceased to exist, as if the concept of illumination had been revoked. Emergency. Lumens should have activated instantly. They did not. In the absolute darkness, Vol 7's optical sensors switched through spectrums: infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma. Nothing. He was receiving input, but his processors couldn't interpret what they were seeing because it didn't correspond to any known form of electromagnetic radiation. Then he heard it, not through his audio sensors, through something deeper, a sound that vibrated through the station's adamantium bones, through the vacuum of space itself, through the dimensional barriers that kept reality coherent. Flutes, drums, a discordant, arrhythmic symphony that felt older than the stars, playing a tune that made his cybernetic components twitch in patterns they weren't designed for. Magos? One of his acolytes spoke into the darkness, voice small and terribly, terribly human. Magos, I can see something in the dark. It's not there, but I can see it. It has angles, too many angles, and they're all pointing at us. Vol 7 tried to respond, but his Vox unit was translating his binary into sounds that formed words in a language he didn't know, but somehow understood. The words meant things like the threshold, the opening, the attention. On his hololithic display, still functioning despite the absence of light, because it too had stopped obeying conventional rules, the darkness was closer, not moving closer, already closer. Distance had become negotiable. His chronometer was running backward. His tech acolytes were screaming, but the screams were coming from their mouths 3 seconds before they opened them. Time was unwinding, or folding, or revealing that it had never been linear in the first place. Vol 7 accessed his emergency protocols, the ones that would flood the station with radiation sufficient to sterilize everything down to the molecular level, the last resort against demonic corruption. He activated them. Nothing happened, because the station had already been destroyed, and also hadn't been built yet, and also existed in all states simultaneously, stretched across moments that occupied the same instant, but were separated by eternities. The last thing Vol 7's fragmenting consciousness recorded before his cogitators began singing in languages composed of colors and emotions was a presence, not a demon, not a warp entity, something that existed in the space beneath existence, pressing against the membrane of reality like a vast eye examining an insect under glass. And he understood, with the clarity that comes just before total madness, that the eye had barely blinked. They had noticed. Across the sector, astropaths began clawing out their own eyes, screaming about geometries that existed before geometry was invented, about colors that were also sounds, that were also emotions that had no name because language was too young to contain them. Navigators locked themselves in their chambers, third eyes sealed behind psychically shielded adamantium, whispering prayers to the God Emperor that for the first time in their lives went unanswered. On distant Terra, in the throne room where the God Emperor of mankind sat imprisoned in his golden cage of machinery and worship, something changed in his eternal psychic emanation. The custodians who stood eternal vigil noticed it immediately. For just a moment, the master of mankind's attention had shifted, turned, focused on something far beyond the galaxy's edge, toward the great rift and the wound within the wound. And for the first time in 10,000 years, those who were psychically sensitive enough to sense such things felt something from their God that they had never felt before. Uncertainty. Inquisitor Covenant Mordred had been hunting demons for 73 years. He had walked through Cornite blood temples where reality bled like wounded meat. He had banished greater demons with nothing but faith and a bolter inscribed with the Emperor's own prayers. He had stood in the presence of chaos corruption that would reduce lesser men to gibbering wrecks, and he had remained unbroken. None of it had prepared him for Terminus Sigma 17th. His strike cruiser, the Unrelenting Truth, translated from warp space 3 days after the research station's last transmission. A garbled data packet that his tech priests had described as mathematically hostile. The station still appeared on augers, structurally intact, emitting power signatures consistent with normal operation. But when Mordred looked at it through the armor glass viewport, something in his veteran's instinct screamed warnings his conscious mind couldn't articulate. "The station appears functional, my lord," Captain Thrain reported from the bridge. "No signs of combat, no warp signatures. But... Mordred turned his scarred face toward his ship's master. "The chronometric readings are inconsistent. According to our instruments, the station is 3 days ahead of us, and also 2 centuries behind, and also hasn't been built yet." Mordred's jaw tightened. 40 years of inquisitorial service had taught him that impossible was merely improbable waiting to kill you. "Assemble my retinue. Boarding action protocols, but keep the Geller fields at maximum. If this is some new chaos sorcery." "Inquisitor," his astropath Velia interrupted, stepping onto the bridge with movements too careful, too controlled. Her face was pale beneath her ceremonial veils, and her hands trembled against her staff. "It's not chaos." The certainty in her voice chilled him more than any demonic presence. "Explain." "I can touch the warp across light years, my lord. I know its currents like a sailor knows the sea. This..." She gestured toward the view screen showing the station. "The warp is afraid of that place. It's pulling away, retreating. The tides of the Imperium are flowing around that station like water around stone that's too cold to touch." "The warp doesn't fear," Mordred stated flatly. "It does now." 30 minutes later, Mordred's Storm Raven descended into Terminus Sigma 17th's primary docking bay. His retinue consisted of 8 battle-hardened operatives, 2 throne agents in ornate carapace armor, a death cult assassin whose name he'd never learned, 3 veteran inquisitorial stormtroopers, his tech priest Magos Ven, and the astropath Velia. Though he'd ordered her to remain aboard ship, she'd insisted with an intensity that brooked no argument. The bay's atmosphere read as normal. Temperature, oxygen content, even the lighting functioned properly. But Mordred's instincts, honed through decades of fighting things that shouldn't exist, screamed that everything was wrong in ways his senses couldn't quite identify. "Auspex readings?" he demanded, his voice crackling through the squad's VoxNet. "Clear, my lord," one stormtrooper reported. "No life signs, no energy spikes, no warp contamination. Station appears abandoned." They advanced through corridors lined with the Mechanicus's typical industrial Gothic architecture, all brass prayer cogs and steel devotional script. The bodies appeared in the 3rd hallway. 23 tech priests and servitors, arranged in a circle around a central point that was completely empty. Not dead. Mordred had seen enough corpses to know the difference. These were still alive, technically. Hearts beating, lungs functioning. But their eyes, organic and cybernetic alike, had been removed with surgical precision and placed in the center of the circle, forming a pattern that hurt to look at. "Emperor's mercy," one of his throne agents whispered. "Don't look at the pattern," Mordred commanded, but it was too late. The agent's head tilted, tracking angles that the eye configuration created. Angles that folded in on themselves, that suggested depths where no depth should exist, that implied geometries incompatible with 3-dimensional space. The agent began to laugh. Not hysteria. Something worse. Comprehension. The sound of a man who'd glimpsed a truth his sanity couldn't survive. Mordred's bolt pistol barked once. Mercy. The Emperor's final gift to those whose minds broke beyond repair. "No one looks at the patterns," he snarled. "Keep your eyes on the corridors. Ven, what am I dealing with?" The Magos approached the circle cautiously, his multiple mechadendrites extending scanning arrays. For 17 seconds, he stood silent, processing. Then his Vox speaker crackled with something that might have been horror if tech priests were capable of such emotional displays. "Inquisitor, these individuals didn't remove their own eyes. The eyes removed themselves. At a cellular level, the organic matter reorganized with purposeful intent. The cybernetic components disassembled and reconstructed according to principles that violate 17 fundamental laws of physics." Chaos corruption? No, my lord. Chaos is disorder masquerading as purpose. This is order. Terrible, incomprehensible order. Mathematics that predate mathematics. Geometry that exists in dimensions our brains aren't structured to process. If I were to describe it theologically rather than scientifically, I would say these people didn't go mad. They understood. And understanding killed them while keeping their bodies alive. Mordred felt the skin on his neck prickle. 7 decades fighting chaos had taught him that madness was the mind's refuge from corruption. But this implied something worse, that comprehension itself was the weapon. They found Magos Vahal 7 in the central augur chamber. He sat at his command throne, every cable and data port still connected, his body perfectly preserved. His 17 optical sensors tracked their entry with mechanical precision. "Magos Val," Mordred addressed him formally. "I am Inquisitor Covenant Mordred. Report your situation." The tech priest's Vox speakers crackled to life. But what emerged wasn't Gothic or binary or any language in the Imperium's vast catalog. It was sound, pure and mathematical, that formed shapes in the air. Shapes that Mordred's eyes interpreted as words despite hearing them, that his ears saw despite reading them. "They come from the angles between." Velia screamed. Mordred spun to see his astropath collapse, blood streaming from beneath her veils. Her psychic senses, far more sensitive than his mundane ones, had touched something in those words. Something that existed in the space between meaning and madness. "Fall back," Mordred commanded. "Now, everyone out." The lights didn't die this time. They changed. The illumination that had been standard Imperial white shifted through colors that had no names, hues that existed in spectrums human eyes shouldn't perceive, but somehow did. The walls remained solid, but Mordred could suddenly see through them, into spaces that existed perpendicular to normal 3-dimensional reality. In those spaces, something moved, not walked, not flew, moved in ways that redefined what movement meant. It was vast and small simultaneously, distant and intimate, approaching and already arrived. Mordred's mind tried to assign it a shape: tentacles, wings, eyes, mouths. But those were just his sanity's desperate attempts to categorize the uncategorizable. What he was seeing wasn't a creature. It was a presence. A fragment of attention from something so monumentally beyond human comprehension that its mere regard was annihilating. His training kicked in. Mordred raised his consecrated bolt pistol and fired at the thing moving through impossible angles. The bolt shell, blessed by the ecclesiarchy and inscribed with prayers that had banished demon princes, passed through the entity without touching it. Not because it missed, because in the space the entity occupied, concepts like touching and missing were negotiable. "The crawling chaos greets you, children of the corpse god." A voice spoke, not through sound but directly into the linguistic centers of their brains. "Your emperor sits rotting on his throne, blind to the truth that we have always been here. We were here before your sun ignited. We will be here when your galaxy is dust. And now, the wound you call chaos has opened the door between. Mordred had stood before demon princes and shouted his faith. He had faced down chaos sorcerers and remained unbroken. But this thing, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, the messenger of entities that made chaos look like a child's temper tantrum, spoke with the casual indifference of describing weather. "In the Emperor's name," Mordred began. "Your Emperor has no name here, no power, no meaning. He is a candle flickering in the dark, convinced his light matters. We are the dark that existed before light was invented." One of his stormtroopers opened fire with his hellgun. The last bolts hit nothing and everything, passing into angles that bent them back through time, so they struck the walls 3 seconds before he pulled the trigger. The Death Cult assassin lunged with monomolecular blades. She moved through the entity and emerged on the other side, screaming in languages that predated human vocal cords. Her perfect muscle memory now executing movements in 11 dimensions. Magos Ven tried to activate his emergency teleport beacon. The device activated perfectly. He vanished and reappeared in the same spot, but wrong. His body reassembled with all the same components in all the same places, but organized according to non-Euclidean principles that left him technically alive and functionally impossible. Mordred grabbed Velia, unconscious and bleeding from every orifice, and ran. His remaining operatives followed. Behind them, the presence that called itself Nyarlathotep didn't pursue. It simply was, occupying every corridor simultaneously, its form shifting between something almost human and something that was all angles and hunger and ancient, terrible amusement. They made it to the Storm Raven. The pilot had kept engines hot, and the moment they were aboard, he punched full thrust, tearing away from the station so violently that inertial dampeners screamed in protest. Mordred strapped Velia into a Medicae harness and turned to his remaining team. 5. He'd gone in with 8. What was that? One stormtrooper whispered, his veteran's composure shattered. Mordred wanted to say, a demon. Wanted to classify it, categorize it, fit it into the enemies he knew how to fight. But lies, even comforting ones, were not the Inquisition's way. "Something worse," he said quietly. "Order the unrelenting truth to prepare for immediate warp translation. Send astropathic message, maximum priority, to Lord Inquisitor Chevak and the Ordos Majoris on Terra. Code Omega Terminus. We have encountered something that is neither chaos nor Xenos. Something that should not exist in any classification." "And the station, my lord?" Mordred looked back at Terminus Sigma 17, still floating intact in the void, lights functioning normally, auger arrays still reaching into the great rift's heart like fingers in a wound. "Exterminatus," he said. "Cyclonic torpedoes. Burn it down to atoms and scatter those atoms into the sun." 6 hours later, after the station had been reduced to expanding plasma, Mordred sat in his private chambers reviewing the mission logs. The exterminatus had worked. The station was gone. But as he watched the recordings of that thing in the impossible angles, he felt cold certainty settle in his bones. Destroying the station hadn't killed it. It had never really been there in the first place. They'd just forced it to notice them, and in noticing, it had delivered a message. The galaxy had been so focused on the Great Rift, on chaos pouring through, that no one had thought to ask, what if something else used that wound to enter? Something older than the warp. Something that regarded even the chaos gods as recent arrivals in a universe that had harbored far darker tenets. Mordred opened the inquisitorial cipher and began composing his report, knowing that somewhere in the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, someone would classify this as madness or corruption. But he also knew the truth. The crawling chaos had delivered its message perfectly. We have always been here, and now we are awake. In the realm of chaos, where reality was a jest and physics were suggestions whispered by mad gods, something unprecedented occurred. The four great powers, the eternal rivals who had danced their cosmic game for millennia uncounted, ceased their warfare. Khorne, the blood god, halted mid-slaughter. In his brass citadel where skull pyramids stretched toward a crimson sky, the endless sounds of battle faltered. Bloodletters paused with swords raised. Bloodthirsters hovered confused in skies that rained gore. The god of murder and martial pride felt something he had not experienced since his first conscious thought crystallized from humanity's first violent impulse. Caution. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, stopped weaving his plots. In his impossible fortress, where corridors changed with every thought and libraries contained books that wrote themselves, every demon scribe froze. The great schemer, who saw infinite futures branching from every moment, who manipulated probability itself as lesser beings moved chess pieces, stared into his well of eternity and saw contradictions, futures that looped back on themselves, possibilities that existed and didn't exist simultaneously, timelines that predated time, and worst of all, gaps, blind spots in his otherwise omniscient sight, spaces where even his all-seeing gaze could not penetrate. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, ceased his experiments. In his fetid garden where diseases evolved and entropy itself was cultivated like a prized flower, even the immortal plagues paused their consumption. The god of decay and inevitable endings felt something impossible, a rot that rotted rot itself, a corruption that corrupted corruption, an ending that came before beginnings and implied that even entropy had a terminus. Slaanesh, the youngest and most volatile, recoiled from the sensation overload that was existence itself. The Dark Prince, who fed on every excess and experience, who gorged on the full spectrum of mortal sensation, encountered something that burned like ice and froze like fire, an experience so alien, so fundamentally other, that even the god of excess couldn't metabolize it. It tasted like nothing, and also everything, and also sensations that existed outside the spectrum of sensation itself. For the first time in their existence, the four powers of chaos were united by a single emotion, uncertainty verging on something that, if they were capable of such weakness, might have been called fear. Tzeentch spoke first, his 9 voices harmonizing in patterns that rewrote the air they traveled through. Something has entered through the wound, not from the Imperium, not from our realm, from beneath. Beneath? Khorne's voice was thunder distilled to rage. There is nothing beneath the blood throne, nothing above, only war eternal. And yet, Tzeentch continued, his form shifting through 999 configurations, each one a lie that was also truth. I have calculated the probabilities. Across 17 million futures, I see the same pattern emerging. We are not the oldest things in the dark. Nurgle laughed, the sound like empires crumbling to dust, but there was unease in it. All things decay, even certainty, even us, yes, yes. But decay implies existence first. What I sense, it existed before existence. It is the rot that existed before there was anything to rot. It hurts, Slaanesh whispered, and the admission cost the Dark Prince more than any defeat. Not pain. I would revel in pain. This is absence, a void that consumes even the concept of consumption. I touched it for an instant, and it was like drowning in nothing while being devoured by everything while experiencing neither. In the center of the warp, where the four gods' territories met in eternally contested boundary wars, a space opened. Not carved or created, it had always been there, they realized with mounting horror. But they had never noticed it. A blind spot in their perception, a gap in their awareness that predated their birth. From that gap, something regarded them, not with eyes, not with intention, simply with the passive awareness that a mountain might have for the ants on its surface, barely conscious of their existence, certainly unconcerned with their conflicts. Khorne, who had never retreated from battle in all his eons, pulled his attention back from that void. What is that? Tzeentch's 9 eyes blinked in 9 different directions, and for the first time since achieving godhood, the architect admitted limitation. I don't know. My sight, which encompasses past, present, and future, cannot penetrate it. It exists in states I have no words for, dimensions I have no mathematics to describe. It is ancient, Nurgle completed, his jovial tone absent. Not old as we measure age. Ancient as in, it was here before here existed. The warp is young. The Imperium is an infant. Even the Citan are children compared to this. Then we destroy it, Khorne declared, because the blood god knew only one response to threats. I will manifest through the wound, marshal every demon in my legion, drown it in endless war until... You cannot fight what cannot be touched, Tzeentch interrupted. I have run the calculations. Every assault you launch will fail, not because it is strong, but because concepts like assault and strong don't apply. It exists in states where war is meaningless because it predates the distinction between conflict and peace. Then we corrupt it, Slaanesh suggested, desperation creeping into perfect features. Everything can be corrupted if you find the right desire, the right excess. It has no desires, Nurgle said quietly. Desire requires awareness of self, awareness of lack. This thing, it doesn't lack anything because it exists before the concept of lacking was invented. It simply is, and its iceness is so fundamental that our being looks like a brief fever dream by comparison. Silence fell across the warp, a phenomenon so rare that demons across the galaxy felt confused as the background roar of chaos simply stopped. Then what do we do? Slaanesh asked, and the question itself was an admission of powerlessness that would have been inconceivable moments before. Tzeentch's form settled into something almost stable. All 9 eyes focused on that impossible void where something regarded them with less attention than they paid to bacteria. We observe, we learn, and we hope, what a delicious irony, that it doesn't fully manifest. Because if what I have glimpsed in the few futures I can still see is accurate, then we are not gods. We are echoes, ripples on a pond. And the thing in the deep has just noticed that the pond exists. In his impossible fortress, Tzeentch retreated to his innermost sanctum, a place that even his most trusted lords of change could not access, and consulted texts stolen from realities that no longer existed. Grimoires, written in languages that predated language itself. Knowledge scraped from the dying thoughts of species that had encountered the outside and not survived. One text, bound in something that was neither matter nor energy nor even concept, held a passage. The words shifted as he read them, fighting translation, but the meaning crystallized with terrible clarity. Before the warp, there was the deep. Before chaos, there was the outside. Before the gods, there were the sleepers, and they dreamed realities into being for purposes even they have forgotten. They are not evil. They are not good. They are prior, and to be noticed by them is to understand that all your existence is a momentary thought in infinite minds that will move on and forget you were ever real. Tzeentch, who hoarded knowledge like dragons hoarded gold, who had spent eons collecting every secret in the galaxy, encountered something he had never experienced before. Information he wished he could unknow. Meanwhile, on the borders of real space and the warp, where Nyarlathotep had manifested through Terminus Sigma 17th. The crawling chaos laughed. Not with malice. Malice would have required caring about the ants beneath its notice. But with amusement at the Chaos God's growing realization. They had thought themselves supreme, eternal, the final powers in the universe's food chain. How delightfully, cosmically wrong they were. Far beyond the galaxy, in the spaces between dimensional membranes, where geometry wasn't yet invented and time was negotiable. Something vast stirred. Not Nyarlathotep. He was merely the messenger, the avatar, the probe sent ahead. This was one of his masters, one of the true outer gods. Yog-Sothoth, the gate and the key, the being who existed at all points in time and space simultaneously, focused a fragment of its infinite attention on this particular galaxy, in this particular reality. It saw the warp and found it curious, a dimension built from emotion and thought, populated by entities who believed themselves powerful. How? Provincial. With effort equivalent to a human noticing a dust mote, Yog-Sothoth extended the smallest tendril of its existence through the wound the Great Rift had created. Not to invade, not to destroy, simply to observe. To catalog this reality as one of the infinite variations it had witnessed across the breadth of forever. In the Materium, navigator houses across the Imperium went dark. Navigators who guided ships through the warp by reading the Astronomicon suddenly found their third eyes showing them vistas that broke their minds. They saw the warp as they always had, but now they also saw through it, saw the deeper layers, saw that the Immaterium was like a painted curtain, and someone had just torn a hole in it to reveal what lay behind. What lay behind was not darkness. It was presence. Infinite, patient, utterly indifferent presence that made the warp look like a child's finger painting hung in a cathedral built before the universe began. Astropaths died by the thousands. Their final messages, scraped from the psychic echoes of their deaths, all contained fragments of the same revelation. The warp is not the deep chaos, is not the dark. We have been screaming at shadows, and the things that cast them have just turned around. An uncraft world Ulthway, where the Eldar lived in constant awareness of their doom, Eldrad Ulthran, the most powerful Farseer in the galaxy, stopped mid-divination. His runestones scattered across the table, and every single one landed in the same configuration. The broken infinity, a pattern that hadn't appeared since before the fall. His hands shook. "Eldrad?" his acolyte asked. "Master, what do you see?" The ancient Farseer looked up with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of gods, that had seen his entire species nearly extinguished. "I see," he said slowly, "that we have been very, very fortunate. All these millennia, we thought she who thirsts was our greatest nightmare. We were wrong. Slaanesh is manageable, understandable, born from our sins, yes, but comprehensible. Then what? The great enemy is not our great enemy," Eldrad whispered. "It is merely the enemy we know. The Chaos Gods are children, powerful children, yes, but still children, and children make noise when they play. That noise has attracted attention from parents who are very, very old, and very, very different from anything we have the capacity to fight." He stood, robes swirling, and began striding toward the Infinity Circuit, the repository of all Eldar souls on the craft world. Seal the Wraithbone sanctuaries. Lock down every psychic conduit. Tell every Farseer to cease their divinations immediately. We must become psychically invisible, right now. Because if those things notice us, truly notice us, then Slaanesh will seem like mercy by comparison. But Master, what are they? Eldrad paused at the chamber entrance, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, and spoke words that would haunt his student forever. They are what the old ones ran from. The reason our makers fled this galaxy and never returned. They're not invaders. They've always been here, sleeping in the spaces we didn't know existed. And the Great Rift has finally woken them up. The madness spread like a plague, but it was not Nurgle's festering gifts. It moved through populations without vector or pathogen, transmitted not through blood or air, but through comprehension itself. On 17 worlds spanning both Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, the same phenomenon manifested within a single solar week. The cults emerged without coordination, without leadership, without communication. Yet they all bore the same symbols. On Mordian, where discipline was beaten into soldiers from birth, an entire regiment of the Iron Guard abandoned their posts. They walked into the Underhives, not as deserters fleeing duty, but as pilgrims seeking revelation. When the commissaria found them 3 days later, they had arranged themselves in geometric patterns across the factory floor, living bodies positioned with mathematical precision, forming angles that hurt to perceive. They were still alive, still breathing, but their minds had been replaced with something else. When questioned, they spoke in unison, their voices layered with harmonics that shouldn't have been producible by human vocal cords. The angles call. We have seen the truth written in dimensions you cannot count. Your emperor is a child's drawing of divinity. We have touched the real. The commissars executed them all. Standard protocol for chaos corruption. But the bodies wouldn't burn properly. The flesh charred and blackened, but the bones remained arranged in those impossible geometric configurations, and even as ash. They maintained patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. On Vostroya, an entire manufactorum devoted to producing las weapons for the Imperial Guard simply stopped. 30,000 workers ceased their labors simultaneously and began modifying the production line. When planetary defense forces broke down the doors, they found the facility transformed into something that was both factory and temple. The workers had built machines that served no mechanical purpose. Devices constructed with perfect engineering precision, but designed to function in spatial dimensions that didn't exist. Gears that meshed at angles perpendicular to themselves. Pistons that compressed spaces rather than matter. Assembly lines that produced components that flickered in and out of conventional reality. We are making way, the workers explained calmly when the stormtroopers aimed lasguns at them. The crawling chaos has shown us the blueprints. The materium is flawed, built wrong. We are correcting it. You should thank us. When the work is complete, pain will have no meaning. Time will have no meaning. The Emperor's corpse light will be unnecessary, because we will exist in dimensions where light and dark are the same state. The Lord Governor ordered orbital bombardment. The manufactorum was reduced to a crater. But within that crater, the melted metal and vitrified stone had cooled into shapes that formed a three-dimensional mandala. Pilots who flew over it reported instruments going haywire. 2 crashed. 17 more requested immediate reassignment, claiming they could still see the pattern when they closed their eyes. On Cadia, or what remained of Cadia, the shattered fragments still holding vigil at the Eye of Terror. The survivors discovered something that made veteran shock troopers weep. Children, hundreds of them, born after the planet's destruction, raised in the refugee fleets and resettlement camps. Children who had never known Cadia whole but carried its warrior tradition in their blood. They had all drawn the same picture. Every child, across 17 different refugee flotillas, using whatever materials they could find. Blood, ash, nutrient paste, scratches on metal, had rendered the same image. A shape that was almost a spiral, but curved in directions that spirals shouldn't curve, with angles that intersected themselves, with depth that existed outside the page. When asked what it was, the children answered with unsettling synchronicity. The yellow sign. It means he is coming, the king in yellow. And when he arrives, Cadia will fall again, and again, and again. Forever falling, forever broken, forever his. The ecclesiarchy intervened immediately. Exorcism rites, purification rituals. The Inquisition's most powerful sanctioned psychers attempted to cleanse the children's minds. Nothing worked. The knowledge was too deeply embedded, written into their consciousness at levels beyond memory or learning. The Inquisition's solution was pragmatic and horrifying. Eversor assassins deployed to 37 locations simultaneously. By the end of the solar week, every child who had drawn the yellow sign was dead. But the images remained, and anyone who looked at them too long found themselves compelled to reproduce them. The contamination was mimetic, spreading not through mystical corruption, but through perception itself. On Krieg, the Death Corps, soldiers bred for suicidal loyalty and complete emotional suppression began reporting to their commissars in unprecedented numbers, not for cowardice, not for doubt, but to request transfers to a mission that didn't exist. "We must go to the Great Rift," they stated with mechanical uniformity. "We are needed there, not to fight, to witness." The Emperor's light does not reach into those depths, and someone must go into the dark to see what's really there. When refused, they went anyway. Entire battalions simply walked away from their posts, ignoring orders, ignoring execution threats, marching toward transit points with inexorable purpose. They would dig trenches as they marched. Their conditioning was that deep. But they would not stop. The Munitorum lost 7 full Krieg regiments in 3 weeks. 12 million soldiers gone. Not defected, not killed, just departed. Heading toward the Great Rift with the same grim determination they'd shown in every meat grinder war they'd ever fought, on Fenris, where the Space Wolves made their home. The wolf priests began reporting disturbing patterns among new aspirants. During the trial of Morkai, where neophytes would battle their inner beast, some were experiencing visions that had nothing to do with the Canis Helix genetic modification. They saw geometries, structures built in dimensions that human or transhuman minds weren't equipped to process, cities that existed in angles perpendicular to reality. And in those cities, entities that wore shapes the way humans wore clothing, temporarily for convenience, not because the shapes meant anything. 3 aspirants went permanently mad. 2 more tried to explain what they'd seen and succeeded only in contaminating other aspirants with the vision. Logan Grimnar ordered the entire generation's trial suspended and brought in rune priests to investigate. The rune priests emerged from their divinations with ash-pale faces. "It's not the warp," they reported. "We know the warp. We surf its tides. This is behind the warp, beneath it. The warp is the ocean's surface. This is something in the deep that the ocean doesn't want to acknowledge exists." But the most disturbing reports came from Kamara, the Dark Eldar's twilight city hidden in the webway. A realm that prided itself on being insulated from the warp, protected from She Who Thirsts, utterly isolated from the Materium's chaos. Archons and homunculi began dying in ways that violated every understanding of their race's cruel immortality. They didn't age, didn't starve for souls, didn't succumb to Slaaneish's pull. They simply stopped, ceased existing mid-sentence, mid-torture, mid-breath. Not killed, erased, edited out of reality as if they had never been. Vect, the supreme overlord of Kamara, convened an emergency council of every cabal, cult, and coven. For the first time in millennia, the Dark City's factions met without scheming, without assassination attempts, without political maneuvering. "Something is editing reality," Vect announced, his ancient voice carrying across the assembly. Not rewriting it, editing, removing elements. I had 17 personal assassins deployed across the city. Now I have 13. The other 4 never existed. I remember them. You remember them. But if we check any record, any memory crystal, any surveillance cogitator, they were never born. They were deleted retroactively. How is that possible? Demanded Lady Malise, herself touched by Szarekh's madness and thus partially immune to conventional reality manipulation. Even she who thirsts cannot undo the past. Time is the one thing even gods must respect. These are not gods, interrupted Urian Ruckarth, the master homunculus. I have spent millennia studying flesh, reality, and the boundaries between. I have dissected demons, vivisected living saints, and experimented on things that should not exist. I understand the warp's corruption at cellular and metaphysical levels. He paused, and for the first time in his endless existence, showed something that might have been fear. This is different. The warp is chaotic, yes, but it follows rules. Emotional rules, but rules nonetheless. This follows no rules because it exists before rules. It is order. Pure, incomprehensible, utterly alien order that makes our reality look like a brief hallucination. A message arrived then, delivered through the webway via Harlequin courier. The Laughing God's servants were the only ones who could still navigate the webway safely, and even they seemed shaken. The message was sealed with Eldrad Ulthran's personal rune. Vect opened it, read silently, then looked up at his assembled court of sadists, schemers, and immortal predators. The Farseers have consulted the Black Library. They found references in texts we thought were mythology. Records from before the Fall, before the Old Ones, before this galaxy knew life. He paused. They are called the Outer Gods, the Great Old Ones, the entities that exist in the spaces between dimensional membranes. And what we're experiencing isn't an invasion, it's attention. They've noticed us. And in noticing us, reality is bending to accommodate their perception. Then we hide, suggested one Archon. Kamarag is invisible to even the Imperium. They don't see the way we see, Vect interrupted. They don't perceive dimensions the way we perceive dimensions. To them, Kamara isn't hidden. It's irrelevant, a scratch on a shadow. And shadows mean nothing to things that cast light we cannot comprehend. Across the galaxy, on Forge worlds and Hive worlds, on Agri worlds and Cardinal worlds, the pattern repeated. Cults emerged, not worshipping chaos, not serving the Ruinous Powers, venerating entities whose names caused syntax errors in Gothic translation matrices. The Inquisition's usual protocols failed. These cultists didn't seek power or immortality or corruption. They sought understanding. And they achieved it. And understanding killed them while their bodies kept working, repurposed into living components of rituals designed to thin the barrier between dimensions. Lord Inquisitor Kirill Cinderman, one of the Ordos Majoris' most senior members, compiled reports from across both Imperiums. The data was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. He sent an astropathic message to Terra, maximum priority, sealed with codes that guaranteed direct delivery to the High Lords. The message was brief. We face extinction from a vector we have no defense against. Chaos we understand. Xenos we can fight. This is neither. Request immediate convocation of all Ordos. Request awakening of stasis-locked Inquisitors from the age of apostasy. Request access to the Black Ship's forbidden archives. Request prayer. Because if faith cannot shield us from this, then the Emperor's protection has limits we never imagined. On Terra, in the throne room where the God Emperor sat locked in his golden prison, the custodians noticed another change. the psychic emanation from their master, the beacon that lit the Astronomicon and guided humanity through the warp, flickered. Just for a moment. But in that moment, it reshaped itself. Broadcast not outward into the warp, but inward, deeper, into spaces the custodians hadn't known existed. As if the Emperor was no longer lighting the way for humanity's ships, he was calling for help from something that existed before even he had walked the earth. The Silent King had not expected to feel dread again. Szarekh, the last of the Triarch, the being who had led the Necron tier into biotransference and damned an entire species to eternal unliving existence, had thought himself beyond such primitive emotions. 60 million years of consciousness locked in living metal had taught him that fear was a luxury of the flesh. He was learning he'd been wrong. His flagship, the Endless Rain, hung in the void beyond the eastern fringe, monitoring the Great Rift's expansion. The Necrons had awakened to find the galaxy infested with the young races. Humans, Eldar, Orcs, squabbling over worlds the Necrons had ruled when those species' ancestors were single-celled organisms. Reclaiming the galaxy should have been a matter of patience and overwhelming technological superiority. But now, the Augurs were showing him something that made those concerns seem quaint. "Awaken the Cryptek Council," Szarekh commanded, his voice resonating through quantum-entangled communication networks. Immediate convocation, priority, extinction protocol. Within nanoseconds, hololithic forms materialized around him. The greatest minds of the Necron race, preserved in android bodies that mocked the flesh they'd once worn. Crypteks who had mastered sciences that made the Adeptus Mechanicus look like children playing with stone tools. Orican the Diviner appeared first, his form crackling with temporal distortions. "My king, I have already run the calculations. Across 17,000 possible futures, I see the same pattern. We are not the oldest things in this galaxy," Szarekh finished. "I know. Show them." The hololithic display shifted, showing deep-range scans of the space surrounding the Great Rift. At first glance, it appeared normal. Well, as normal as a massive warp breach could be. But Orican's temporal analysis revealed something else. The rift wasn't just tearing space, it was creating wounds in dimensions that the Necron's own dimensional science couldn't fully map. "Impossible," stated Illuminor Xeras, the master of biotransference. "We cataloged every dimension in this universe during the war in heaven. We mapped the Imperium, the warp, the webway, even the pocket dimensions the old ones used for their experiments. There are no unknown dimensional spaces." "Were," Orican corrected, his voice tight with something approaching panic. "There were no unknown dimensional spaces. But what we're detecting now isn't in this universe. It's adjacent to it, perpendicular to it. These dimensions exist at angles to reality that our mathematics weren't designed to describe." Szarekh gestured, and the display zoomed deeper. At quantum levels, reality itself was beginning to show cracks. Not warp breaches, those the Necrons understood and could seal with their pylon technology. These were different. Fractures in the fundamental structure of space-time that bled into spaces that operated under alien geometries. "Explain it simply," Szarekh commanded. "What are we facing?" Cryptek Ahmontek, master of chronomancy, spoke carefully. "My king, you remember the war in heaven. You remember the old ones. I remember destroying them." The bitterness in Zarekh's voice could have corroded adamantium. "I remember learning too late that they had warned us not to wage total war. We thought them cowards. We were fools." "They weren't cowards," Ahmontek continued. "They were running. I've accessed deep archive data from tomb worlds that predated even the biotransference. Records from when we were still flesh. The old ones didn't create the webway to traverse the galaxy efficiently. They created it to hide, to create pocket dimensions where they could exist without being noticed. Noticed by what? By things that existed before the galaxy formed, before the universe cooled enough for matter to condense, before the concept of before had meaning. Amontek's voice carried a weight that 60 million years of unliving existence couldn't diminish. The old ones called them the deep ones, the outside, the things that should not be perceived. And the reason the war in heaven ended so catastrophically wasn't just because we unleashed the Citan. It's because our war was so violent, so reality-breaking, that we drew their attention. Szarekh's mind, artificial but vast, processed this. The Enslaver Plague. You're saying it wasn't just warp entities pouring through rifts we created. The Enslavers were the warp's immune response to something worse. The warp itself was trying to seal the breaches before they could enter. We thought we'd won the war. We destroyed the old ones, shattered the Citan, claimed the galaxy, and then reality itself tried to kill us all to prevent something worse from noticing we existed. The council chamber fell silent. Even for beings who had lived millions of years, this revelation carried weight. Orikan materialized a temporal projection. I have traced the timeline. Every extinction event in galactic history, the Enslaver Plague, the fall of the Eldar, even the Age of Strife, correlates with moments when psychic activity reached critical mass. Not because psychic power is inherently dangerous, but because it's loud. It makes noise, and noise attracts attention from the deep. Then the Great Rift is a dinner bell. Xeris finished, his usual clinical detachment cracking. The humans, in their ignorance, have rung the largest, loudest psychic alarm in galactic history. And things that have been sleeping in the spaces between spaces are waking up to investigate the sound. Szarekh's internal chronometer marked the moment. This was the point where strategy shifted from conquest to survival. Options. The pylons, suggested Cryptek Zandrek, master of the null field technology. We built them to suppress warp activity during the war in heaven. If we can activate enough of them, we might be able to contain the breaches. Won't work, Orikan interrupted. I've already calculated it. The pylons were designed to suppress the warp. These entities aren't warp-based. They exist in states the pylons can't affect because they weren't designed to affect those states. It would be like trying to use a net to catch a concept. Then we seal the galaxy, Szarekh stated. Dolmen Gates. We isolate this entire region of space in a null-time bubble. Whatever's coming can't reach what doesn't exist in conventional time. That would require simultaneously activating every dolmen gate and pylon in the galaxy, Xeris calculated. Coordinating millions of tomb worlds, many of which are still dormant or damaged. The power requirements alone are irrelevant if the alternative is extinction that makes biotransference look like immortality. Szarekh's voice carried absolute authority. Begin the protocols. Wake every tomb world, every dynasty, every cryptek. I don't care about the infinite, empire's political divisions. This is beyond politics. My king, Orikan said carefully, there's another option, one you won't like. Speak. We ally with the humans, and the Eldar, and possibly even the Tyranids if we can communicate with their hive mind. The temporal diviner's form flickered with probability matrices. I've run 17,000 scenarios. The only futures where any life survives the next century are the ones where every faction works together. The suggestion was obscene. The Necrons were the rightful inheritors of the galaxy. The humans were barely evolved primates wearing stolen technology. The Eldar were the Old One's failed children. Working together was philosophically repugnant. But Szarekh had not survived 60 million years by clinging to pride over pragmatism. "Contact the Imperium," he commanded. "Use the diplomatic protocols from the Sautek dynasty. Find their leaders. Tell them." He paused, considering. "Tell them the Silent King requests parley. Priority, mutual survival. Tell them we know what's coming, and if they don't listen, their corpse emperor will be remembered as the being who doomed all life in the galaxy to something worse than death." "They'll never believe us," Szarekh objected. "The humans see us as soulless machines, enemies to be destroyed, not allies." "Then show them proof," Szarekh said coldly. "Orican, project the futures you've seen, the ones where this continues unchecked." The temporal cryptek hesitated, then complied. The hololithic chamber filled with visions of futures that violated causality. Galaxies where time ran backward and forward simultaneously. Worlds that existed in geometric configurations that caused sensor systems to crash trying to render them. Populations that had gone mad en masse, their bodies still functioning, but their minds replaced with something that thought in dimensions mortal consciousness couldn't access. And through it all, the presence. Vast beyond measurement, patient beyond comprehension. Advancing not through space, but through layers of reality, peeling back dimensional barriers like a surgeon opening skin to examine organs beneath. In one particularly horrifying future vision, Terra itself still existed, but wrong. The Imperial Palace had been reconfigured into a non-Euclidean structure that served as a beacon. The Astronomicon still burned, but its light had changed, broadcasting not hope, but revelation. And everyone who saw that light understood the truth. Humanity was not the Emperor's chosen. They were experiments, bacteria in a petri dish. And the scientists who'd left the dish untended for a while had returned to check on their culture's progress. The visions ended. "How long?" Szarekh asked quietly. "Before they fully manifest?" "Difficult to calculate precisely. Time becomes non-linear in their presence. But based on the rate of dimensional decay around the Great Rift, Orican's calculations flickered through probability, matrices. 20 solar months, maybe less. Maybe it's already happened and we won't know until the effects propagate backward through time to reach us." Szarekh turned his attention outward, toward the distant glow of the Great Rift. Somewhere in that wound, something vast was stirring. Something that made the war in heaven look like a schoolyard squabble. Something that the Citan, star gods who had devoured suns, had avoided mentioning to the Necrontyr because even beings who ate stars didn't want to acknowledge what lived in the deep. "Send the message to the Imperium," he commanded, "and begin awakening protocols for every tomb world in the galaxy. If we're going to survive this, we'll need every dynasty, every cryptek, every warrior. Contact the Eldar through back channels. Find their Farseers. Tell them the Necrons are willing to discuss a temporary cessation of hostilities. The dynasties will rebel at such heresy," Szarekh warned. "Then they will die with their pride, intact." Szarekh replied, "I did not endure 60 million years of undeath to surrender the galaxy to entities that predate the concept of galaxies. If temporary alliance with primitives is the price of survival, so be it. Pride is a luxury of species who aren't facing extinction from something that can literally edit them out of reality." He paused, accessing deep memory archives from when he was still flesh, still mortal, still capable of feeling the full weight of existential dread. "The Old Ones knew," he said softly. "That's why they fled. Not because they couldn't fight the Citan, but because fighting would draw attention. They tried to warn us. We called them cowards and waged total war anyway. And we drew the outside's attention once before. We barely survived. The galaxy barely survived. And now the humans have done the same thing, Szarekh observed. History repeating. No, Szarekh corrected. History rhyming. This time we know what's coming. This time we have warning. This time. He looked at his council of ancient, inhuman intellects. This time, we might be able to do what the old ones couldn't. Not defeat them. You cannot defeat things that exist before the concept of defeat. But perhaps we can make ourselves too irritating to bother with, too complicated to edit out cleanly, survive through being more trouble than we're worth. A victory through annoyance, Orican said dryly. How the mighty Infinite Empire has fallen. The Infinite Empire fell 60 million years ago, Szarekh replied. What remains is survival, and I will do whatever survival requires. Even if it means fighting alongside Monkish and Eldar against an enemy none of us can truly comprehend. Orders went out across the galaxy, transmitted through quantum-entangled communication networks that operated faster than light. Tomb worlds began waking from their millennia-long slumber. Ancient weapons were brought online. Cryptechs who had spent millions of years in stasis were revived and briefed on the situation. And for the first time since the war in heaven, the Necrons prepared not for conquest, but for survival against an enemy that made the Satan look like children playing with fire. An enemy that had always been there, sleeping in the spaces between spaces, waiting for someone to make enough noise to wake them up. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, son of the God Emperor, stood in the strategium of the Macraga's honor and contemplated the impossible. Before him stretched hololithic displays showing 17 sectors simultaneously collapsing into madness. Not chaos corruption. He knew that enemy intimately. This was different, cleaner, more organized. Populations weren't being twisted by the Ruinous Powers' gifts. They were being replaced. Their bodies remained functional, but their minds had been overwritten with something else. "Show me Mordian again," he commanded. The tactical display shifted, magnifying the industrial world. Mordian had been a bastion of Imperial discipline for millennia. Its Iron Guard regiments were legendary for their unwavering loyalty. Now, entire cities had reorganized themselves into geometric patterns visible from orbit. Millions of citizens arranged in configurations that made his transhuman mind ache trying to perceive them correctly. "Lord Commander," Captain Sicarius reported, his voice tight with poorly concealed unease. "The Mordian High Command has ceased responding to Vox hails. Their last transmission was unusual." "Play it." Static-laced audio filled the chamber. Through the interference came voices, thousands of them, speaking in perfect synchronization. "We no longer serve the corpse god. We serve truth. We serve the angles. We serve those who existed before existence. Tell the Primarch his father is a lie written in dying light. The real gods are returning, and they don't care if we worship them. They barely notice we exist. And that indifference is more honest than the Emperor's false love ever was." Guilliman's jaw tightened. He had never been comfortable with his father's deification. The Emperor had expressly forbidden worship, preached the imperial truth, that there were no gods, only natural laws waiting to be understood. Yet after the heresy, after 10,000 years of his imprisonment on the Golden Throne, the Imperium had made him a god anyway. Guilliman had returned from stasis to find his father's dream perverted into a theocracy. He'd been pragmatic about it, accepting that faith, however irrational, gave the Imperium strength against chaos. But now that faith was failing, not breaking. Failing, becoming irrelevant. "Inquisitor Mordred's report," he said quietly. Bring it up." The hololithic display showed Covenant Mordred's compiled intelligence from Terminus Sigma 17 and subsequent investigations. Guilliman had read it 3 times, hoping each reading would make it less impossible. It hadn't worked. Entities that existed outside the warp, that predated the galaxy, that regarded even the chaos gods as recent arrivals. Beings whose mere attention caused reality to fracture and populations to go collectively insane, not from madness, but from comprehension. "My lord," said Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines. "With respect, this reads like the ravings of someone exposed to chaos corruption. Entities that exist before existence? Mathematics that predate mathematics? It's nonsense. Dangerous nonsense." "I would agree," Guilliman replied carefully, "if not for the Necron delegation." That statement caused visible shock among his assembled commanders. The Necrons, soulless machines, ancient enemies, Xenos to be destroyed on sight, had sent a diplomatic envoy under flag of truce. The message had been delivered via captured astropath, the poor soul's mind wiped clean by exposure to whatever the Necrons used for communication. The message itself had been simple. The Silent King requests immediate parley with the Lord Commander of the Imperium. Topic: mutual survival. The entities breaching through the Great Rift are not warp-based. They are outside. We have encountered them before. If you wish to prevent total extinction of all life in this galaxy, meet us at these coordinates within 10 solar days. "It's a trap," Sicarius insisted. "The Xenos seek to—" "The Necrons don't use traps," Guilliman interrupted. "They use overwhelming technological superiority. If they wanted me dead, they would simply attack." He gestured at the data streams pouring in from across both Imperiums. "No, they're afraid. And if beings who fought the old ones and shattered star gods are afraid, then I need to know why. You can't seriously be considering meeting with Xenos," Calgar said, his voice carrying decades of indoctrination against such heresy. "I am considering," Guilliman said coldly, "whether pride is worth extinction. The galaxy is burning, Marneus. The Great Rift has split us in half. Chaos is ascendant. My father sits dying on his throne, unable to provide guidance. And now something else has entered the game. Something that makes even the Necrons nervous." He pulled up another data feed. This one from the Mechanicus's most secretive forges, where Archmagos Call had been conducting experiments on the nature of reality itself. Call's preliminary analysis suggests that whatever breached through the Great Rift exists in a dimensional state fundamentally incompatible with our universe. Not warp entities. Those at least obey the laws of the Imperium. These things operate under geometries that shouldn't be possible. When they manifest, reality itself has to restructure around them. And that restructuring is what's driving populations insane. "Then we fight them," Sicarius declared. "As we fight all enemies of mankind. With faith and bolter, we—" "You cannot shoot something that exists in dimensions you cannot perceive," Guilliman snapped. "You cannot have faith in protection from entities that don't acknowledge faith as a concept. This isn't chaos, Cato. Chaos corrupts, chaos tempts, chaos offers power. These things don't offer anything. They don't corrupt. They simply are, and their existence is incompatible with ours." He turned back to the tactical display, where the infected zones were spreading. Slowly, methodically, following patterns that his strategic genius recognized as deliberate but couldn't anticipate. "Prep my honor guard," he commanded. "We're meeting with the Silent King, and send word to the Eldar through whatever back channels we have. If the Necrons are this concerned, I want to know what the Eldar know. They're older than the Imperium. They might have records of this." my lord, Kelgar said carefully. The Inquisition will never approve alliance with Xenos. The Ecclesiarchy will call it heresy. Half the Imperium's leadership will see it as... Then they can court-martial me after we survive, Guilliman interrupted. I did not claw my way back from 10,000 years of stasis to watch the galaxy die because we were too proud to accept help. My father built the Imperium on pragmatism, not dogma. We used Xenos technology when it suited us. We made treaties when necessary. It was only after I fell that the Imperium became this theocratic nightmare that values purity over survival. He looked at his assembled commanders, warriors who had fought beside him, bled beside him, who represented the finest the Imperium could produce. I am going to tell you something that would be considered the blackest heresy, something the Ecclesiarchy would burn entire worlds for speaking aloud. He paused, weighing each word. The Emperor is not a god. He never wanted to be worshipped. And the entities breaching into our reality, they are gods. Real ones, ancient ones, the kind that existed before the concept of worship was invented. And they don't care about our prayers because they barely notice we exist. The silence was absolute. The question, Guilliman continued, is whether we can survive their notice. Whether we can make ourselves irrelevant enough that they move on to whatever cosmic purpose they serve. Or whether we fight. And if we fight, whether faith and fury are enough against things that predate. Both. A priority transmission interrupted, sealed with inquisitorial codes of the highest authority. Guilliman opened it, expecting another report of cultist activity or demon incursions. What he got was far worse. Video feed from Inquisitor Mordred, recorded 3 hours ago. The Inquisitor looked haggard, his eyes carrying the weight of knowledge no man should bear. Behind him, visible through the viewport, hung a world Guilliman recognized. Cadia, or what remained of it. Lord Commander, Mordred's recorded voice began. I am transmitting from the Cadian Gate. What remains of it? 3 hours ago, we detected an anomaly in the debris field. Not a ship, not an asteroid, a structure. It appeared without transition, not through warp travel. It simply became real where nothing had been real before. The feed switched to external augers. There, floating among Cadia's shattered remnants, was a city, not a space station. A city. Impossible architecture that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Spires that curved into angles that hurt to perceive. Walls that were both solid and transparent, depending on viewing angle. We sent a scanner drone, Mordred continued. It transmitted for 17 seconds before... I can't explain what happened to it. The telemetry suggests it was translated into a state where it existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, and then compressed back down to 3. The footage it captured before destruction is... Lord Commander, I've fought demons. I've witnessed possession. I've stood in the eye of terror itself. This is worse. The video feed showed the drone's final transmission, the city's interior. Vast halls that seemed to stretch infinitely despite being clearly bounded. And entities, not demons, not aliens. Things that wore shapes the way humans wore masks, temporarily for convenience. Shapes that shifted moment to moment because their true forms existed in too many dimensions to perceive simultaneously. And in the city's heart, on a throne of angles that intersected themselves, sat something almost humanoid. Tall, thin, wrapped in yellow robes that moved in winds that didn't exist. Its face, if it could be called a face, was covered by a pallid mask with features that seemed to change based on viewing angle. It spoke. Mordred's voice was barely a whisper. Not through Vox, not through the warp. Through existence itself. Every surface vibrated with its words. Every atom became a speaker. It called itself the King in Yellow. And it said, the recording cut out, then resumed. Mordred's face was pale, hands shaking. It said, Cadia stands and falls and stands and falls forever. Because linear time is a lie, you tell yourselves to feel safe. I have made this world my stage. Act 1 is complete. Act 2 begins when the Lord Commander arrives to treat with the Machine Kings who fled their flesh. Act 3 is when you realize you've been performing for an audience you can't see, and they've grown bored with your play. The transmission ended. Guilliman stood silent, processing. The tactical implications were staggering. An entity that could manifest entire cities from nothing, that spoke of time as negotiable, that claimed to control events yet to happen. My lord? Calgar's voice carried concern. Orders? Guilliman looked at his chapter master, at the warriors who had followed him through impossible odds, who had fought beside him to hold the Imperium together. Send word to the Silent King, he said quietly. Tell him I accept the parley. Immediate departure. Full honor guard, but make it clear this is diplomatic contact, not military threat. And send a separate message to Terra. Tell the High Lords that I am enacting emergency powers under Article 17 of the Lex Imperialis. The Lord Commander has authority to make treaties in times of existential threat. This qualifies. And the thing on Cadia? Sicarius asked. The King in Yellow? We ignore it, Guilliman said, though the words tasted like poison. For now, because engaging it is exactly what it wants. It claims we're performing in its play. The only way to win is to refuse to perform. Let it sit in its impossible city and wait for an audience that won't come. He turned back to the hololithic displays, watching the infected zones spread, watching populations go quietly mad, watching reality itself begin to fray at the edges. And pray, he added softly, that my father has answers, because I certainly don't. On Terra, in the throne room, the God Emperor's psychic emanation pulsed with something that the attending custodians interpreted as anticipation, not fear, not hope, but the focused attention of a being who had been waiting for this moment for 10,000 years, waiting for the galaxy to finally learn what he had always known, that the warp was the shallow end of the pool. And things swam in the deep that made chaos look like children splashing in bathwater. The Black Library existed in the webway, hidden behind wards and mazes and illusions so complex that even the Eldar who built it sometimes had trouble finding it. It was the repository of all forbidden knowledge, texts too dangerous for any mind, mortal or immortal, to safely read. Information that could break sanity, unravel souls, or teach truths that should remain forever hidden. Eldrad Ulthran, eldest of Farseers, stood before its gates for the first time in 3 centuries. Beside him stood representatives of every major craft world, Alaitok, Bieltan, Sayimhan, Ayandan. Even dark kin from Kamara had sent observers, Vect himself had insisted, which told Eldrad exactly how dire the situation was. The gates opened without prompt, as if the library itself had been expecting them. The laughing gods Harlequins emerged, guardians of this place, servants of Kegorach, the only Eldar god to survive the fall intact, because he'd been clever enough to hide. The Shadowseer will speak, with you, a Harlequin announced, their masked face unreadable. But be warned, what you seek to know cannot be unknown. The Black Library opens its deepest vaults only when the alternative is worse than the knowledge contained within. They were led through halls that existed in impossible configurations, stairs that led upward while going down, corridors that were longer inside than outside, spaces that folded through dimensions the webway shouldn't touch. This was intentional. The Black Library's architecture was designed to be incomprehensible, to break the minds of intruders before they could reach the truly dangerous texts. But Eldrad had walked these paths before. He knew their tricks, and more importantly, he knew that today, the library wanted to be found. The Shadow Seer waited in a chamber that shouldn't exist, a room that was simultaneously inside the library and outside reality itself. They wore the traditional motley of Kegorak's servants, but their mask was different, ancient, carved from something that predated the Eldar's own history. Eldrad Ulthrin, the Shadow Seer spoke, voice layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers occupying one form. You come seeking knowledge of the outside, the things beyond the veil, the entities that should not be named, but cannot be avoided. We do, Eldrad confirmed. Our people have records stretching back millions of years. Surely we encountered these entities before? You didn't, the Shadow Seer interrupted. Your people were too young, too new. But your makers did, the old ones. The beings who uplifted your species, who gave you psychic sensitivity and crafted you as weapons against the Necrontyr. They knew, and they fled. The chamber's walls shimmered, becoming screens that showed vistas of history so ancient that the galaxy itself looked different. Eldrad saw the war in heaven, not as legend, but as recorded fact. Saw the old ones in their glory, beings of pure psychic might who could seed entire worlds with life, who created species as artists create sculptures. And he saw them running. The war in heaven was going poorly, the Shadow Seer narrated. The Necrontyr, empowered by the Citan, were winning. Reality itself was being weaponized. The old ones created the Krork, the Eldar, the Jokero, warrior races to fight back. But the war's violence was catastrophic. Suns were extinguished, worlds were dragged through dimensions. The warp itself was being torn open by the psychic screaming of dying civilizations. The vision shifted, showed rifts opening. Not warp rifts, these were different. Wounds in reality that bled darkness that wasn't absence of light, but presence of something else. And through those wounds, the old ones sensed them. The outside. The entities that existed before the universe cooled, before matter condensed, before the concept of before had meaning. The old ones had encountered them once before, billions of years earlier, and had barely survived by making themselves so insignificant that the outside lost interest. But now the war had made them loud, noticeable. The old ones realized that if they continued fighting, they would draw full attention from the outside. So they made a choice. They fled, abandoned the galaxy, left through gates that led to dimensions so far removed from this reality that even the outside couldn't easily follow. Eldrad felt cold understanding settle in his ancient bones. The webway. They didn't build it as a transportation network. They built it as an escape route. Precisely. The webway was never meant to just connect worlds. It was meant to create spaces outside the normal universe. Pocket dimensions where life could exist without being noticed by things that swim in the deep. But they didn't finish it. The Necrons and Citan interrupted. The old ones fled before completing their work, and what remained was a half-finished lifeboat that your people inherited. The vision shifted again, showed the aftermath of the war in heaven, the enslaver plague, warp entities pouring through rifts, consuming populations wholesale. Eldrad had always been taught this was the warp's natural response to psychic wounds. That was a lie, the Shadow Seer said, reading his thoughts. The enslavers weren't from the warp. They were the warp's immune system. Reality itself, trying to seal the breaches before the outside could enter. The enslavers consumed psychically sensitive species not out of malice, but to reduce the galactic noise level, to make the universe quiet enough that the outside would stop paying attention. It worked, Eldrad realized. The galaxy went silent for millions of years. The Necrons went into stasis. The Eldar inherited an empty galaxy, and the outside forgot we existed. Until the fall, the Shadowseer confirmed. When your people's depravity birthed Slaanesh, you created a psychic scream so loud it tore the galaxy open. You announced to the entire universe and beyond that intelligent life still existed here, still made noise, still mattered enough to notice. And the Great Rift was a dinner bell. The humans, in their stumbling ignorance, have rung the loudest psychic alarm in galactic history. They split their own galaxy in half with warp energy. They broadcast humanity's existence across dimensional barriers that should never have been breached. And now, the outside is waking up to investigate what's making all that racket. The Shadowseer gestured, and the chamber's walls became transparent. Through them, Eldrad could see deeper layers of reality, could perceive dimensions his psychic senses normally couldn't access. And in those dimensions, he saw them. Vast, patient, moving with the inevitability of continental drift. Not swimming toward the galaxy, they didn't move through space in any conventional sense. They were revealing themselves, pulling back veils that had always separated them from conventional reality, letting their presence bleed through dimensional barriers. How many? Eldrad whispered. The outer gods? Impossible to count. They don't exist as discrete entities the way we do. Azathoth is one being and infinite beings. Yog-Sothoth exists at all points in space and time. Nyarlathotep has 1,000 forms and 0 forms. But if you're asking how many have turned their attention toward this galaxy, the Shadowseer paused. 3. Only 3. And that's enough to end everything. Can they be fought? No. Can they be banished? No. Can they be reasoned with? No. They don't think the way we think. They don't want the way we want. They don't exist the way we exist. Imagine trying to negotiate with gravity, trying to fight the passage of time, trying to banish the concept of geometry itself. That's what you're asking. Farseer Irilith of Iyanden stepped forward, her wraithbone staff crackling with psychic energy. Then why show us this? If we cannot fight or flee or negotiate, what purpose does this knowledge serve besides despair? The Shadowseer's mask tilted, and for a moment, Eldrad caught a glimpse of something behind it. Something that might have been Szarekh himself, the laughing god who survived the fall through cunning and misdirection. Because, the Shadowseer said, there is one option you haven't considered. You cannot defeat them, but you can bore them. Silence. Elaborate, Eldrad demanded. The outside exists on timescales you cannot comprehend. To them, the entire lifespan of this galaxy, from the Big Bang to its eventual heat death, is a single moment. They experience all of it simultaneously. When they notice something, it's not because it's dangerous. It's because it's interesting, novel, worth examining. The Shadowseer began pacing, form flickering between dancer and scholar and something neither. The war in heaven was interesting. Billions of deaths, reality-warping weapons, the Citan devouring stars, that was worth watching. So they watched. And their watching almost destroyed everything, because their attention itself alters reality. Then they got bored and left. Farseer Kelemith of Bealtan said slowly, understanding dawning. The war ended. The galaxy went quiet. They found something else more interesting elsewhere. Exactly. And the fall was interesting. An entire species birthing a new chaos god through collective debauchery? Worth investigating. But Slaanesh stabilized, became predictable, boring, So they started to lose interest again. Until the Great Rift. Until the Great Rift, the Shadowseer confirmed. Which is very, very interesting. A galaxy splitting in half, chaos ascendant, new conflicts erupting across millions of worlds. It's the most interesting thing to happen in this galaxy in millions of years. So they're investigating, coming to see what all the noise is about. Eldrad's mind raced through implications. Then the solution is to make ourselves boring, uninteresting, not worth their attention. In theory, yes. In practice, the Shadowseer gestured, and new visions appeared. Showed Guilliman meeting with the Silent King. Showed Eldar and humans and Necrons working together. Showed the galaxy uniting against a common threat. Cooperation is boring. Unity is boring. Peace, even desperate peace, is boring. War is interesting. Chaos is interesting. If the galaxy can unify, truly unify, and stabilize, then you become background noise. Static. Something to ignore while they search for more interesting realities to observe. You're suggesting, Eldrad said carefully, that our survival depends on ending the conflicts that have defined this galaxy for millions of years. That Eldar and humans, and even Necrons, must work together not just tactically, but fundamentally. I'm suggesting that your survival depends on becoming so mundane, so predictable, so stable, that cosmic entities who experience eternity as a single moment look at you and decide you're not worth watching. Yes, Prince Iriel of Iandan laughed bitterly. Impossible. The Imperium will never trust Xenos. The Necrons want to reclaim their empire. Our own people are fractured between craft worlds, exodites, and dark kin. You're asking for a miracle. No, the Shadowseer corrected. I'm telling you the price of survival. Whether you pay it is your choice. But understand, if you continue your wars, your conflicts, your interesting struggles, they will keep watching. And their watching will reshape reality until nothing you recognize remains. A new vision appeared, this one showing a possible future. The galaxy transformed. Populations living in cities built according to non-Euclidean geometries, civilizations that had been edited and revised like text in a manuscript. Life continuing technically, but so fundamentally altered that calling it life was charitable. This is what happens if you remain interesting, the Shadowseer said quietly. They don't destroy, they don't corrupt. They observe and document and experiment. You become specimens in a cosmic study that will continue until the universe ends. Your consciousness remains, but filtered through dimensional states you weren't meant to experience. You'll exist forever, aware, unable to die, trapped in configurations of being that violate everything you understand about existence. And if we become boring? They move on, eventually. It might take centuries, millennia. But their attention will shift to other realities, other dimensions, other cosmic phenomena more worthy of study. And you'll survive. Changed, certainly. Damaged, probably. But alive in ways you recognize as alive. Eldrad looked at the assembled representatives. Saw fear, yes, but also determination. His people had survived the fall, had clawed their way back from extinction, had learned to live on the edge of annihilation with she who thirsts eternally waiting. They were nothing if not survivors. Then we need to do something the galaxy has never done, he said quietly. We need to unite every faction, every species, every power, not through conquest, not through force, but through shared understanding that the alternative is worse than death. The Imperium will never agree, Vect's representative said flatly. The Maquis see Xenos as enemies to be destroyed. Their entire ideology is built on human supremacy. Then we make them agree, Eldrad replied. We show them what I've just seen. We bring their Primarch here. Let him witness the truth. Let him understand that pride and doctrine and 10,000 years of dogma are luxuries they can no longer afford. And if he refuses? Eldrad's ancient eyes held absolute certainty. Then the galaxy dies, and we die with it. But at least we'll have tried. The Shadowseer's mask seemed to smile. The laughing god approves. He has always favored cunning over force, misdirection over direct conflict. If you can make yourselves boring enough, uninteresting enough, insignificant enough, you might just survive to rebuild after they leave. How do we begin? Irilith asked. The Primarch meets with the Silent King in 3 solar days. I will arrange for Eldar representation. Uninvited, unwelcome, but necessary. The 3 eldest powers in this galaxy, Imperium, Necrons, Eldar, must forge an alliance that transcends hatred and history. And you must do it while being watched by entities that find conflict fascinating. A paradox, Kelemeth observed. We must unite through cooperation, but cooperation is only necessary because we face a threat. That threat makes us interesting. Our response to it makes us interesting. How do we stop being interesting while dealing with something so interesting? The Shadowseer laughed, a sound like breaking crystal and distant thunder. That's the game. That's always been the game. The outside doesn't care if you win or lose. They just want a good show. Your job is to put on the worst, most boring show imaginable. Make peace, so mundane they change the channel. The vision faded. The chamber returned to normal, or what passed for normal in the Black Library. Go, the Shadowseer commanded. Prepare your people. The next few months will determine whether the Eldar race survives in any meaningful form. And remember, Szarekh, the Laughing God, survived the fall by being too clever to catch, too quick to pin down, too absurd to take seriously. Perhaps there's a lesson in that. As they left the Black Library, Eldred felt the weight of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. He had lived for thousands of years, had witnessed the fall, had seen his people reduced from galaxy-spanning empire to scattered refugees. But this was different. This wasn't about Eldar survival. This was about whether consciousness itself, in any form, would continue to exist in recognizable states. Send word to the Primarch, he instructed his acolytes. Tell him the Eldar request presence at his meeting with the Silent King. Tell him we bring information about the true nature of the threat. And tell him. He paused, considering how to phrase what came next. Tell him that the Emperor knew, has always known, and that's why he's been silent, because speaking would draw their attention. The message was sent through the webway, carried by swift runners who could traverse the galaxy in hours. It reached Guilliman as his fleet prepared for departure to meet the Necron delegation. The Primarch read it once, twice, then looked up at his assembled command staff. It seems, he said quietly, that we're about to have a very crowded meeting and possibly learn truths that will make the Horus heresy look like a family disagreement. The meeting took place in a location that satisfied no one and terrified everyone. The ruins of Cadia. Guilliman had chosen it deliberately. If the entity calling itself the King in Yellow claimed to have made Cadia its stage, then holding the parley here sent a message. We are not afraid. We will not hide. And if you're watching, know that we see you too. It was bravado mostly. But bravado was all they had. The Macragge's honor translated from warp space at the system's edge, accompanied by a full battle group, 3 strike cruisers, a dozen escorts, and enough firepower to level continents. Guilliman knew it was meaningless against what they faced, but appearances mattered. The Imperium's Lord Commander, could not arrive weak. Already present was the Necron fleet. 7 tomb ships arranged in perfect geometric formation, their living metal hulls reflecting starlight in ways that seemed to bend space itself. At their center hung the Endless Reign, the Silent King's flagship, vessel that predated human civilization by millions of years. And there, shimmering into existence through webway portals, came the Eldar, craft-world vessels from Ulthwé, Ayanden, and Saim-Han, sleek, organic shapes that moved like hunting birds. Behind them, in a show of unity that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, came dark Eldar raiders from Kamara, angular, predatory ships that radiated malice. 3 species, 3 ancient enemies, meeting in the shadow of Cadia's corpse while something incomprehensible watched from a city that shouldn't exist. All ships, weapons cold, Guilliman commanded. Any vessel that powers weapons without authorization will be fired upon by all other parties. Make that clear across all frequencies. The message went out in Gothic, Necron hyperspatial codes, and Eldar psychic whispers. For 17 tense seconds, nothing happened. Then, one by one, energy signatures dimmed. Weapons went offline, lance batteries powered down. "My lord," Sicarius reported, "the Necrons are transmitting coordinates for a neutral meeting ground. They've activated some kind of structure on Cadia's largest remaining fragment. It appears to be generating a stable atmosphere and gravity field." Guilliman studied the tactical display. The structure was Necron in origin. Pylons arranged in a perfect circle, creating a pocket of normal spacetime in the midst of the debris field. A neutral ground where biological life could survive, and where even the warp's influence was suppressed to near zero. "Acknowledge. Prepare my personal Thunderhawk. Full honor guard, but leave the Grey Knights aboard ship. Their psychic presence might complicate matters." He looked at his assembled commanders. "Calgar, you have command in my absence. If I don't return within 6 hours, assume the worst and begin evacuation protocols." "My lord." "That's an order, Marneus." 20 minutes later, Guilliman's Thunderhawk descended toward the Necron structure. Around him sat his honor guard, Sicarius, 10 Victrix guard in full Gravis armor, and, at his insistence, Inquisitor Mordred. The Inquisitor had been the first to encounter these entities. His perspective would be valuable. They landed on a platform that was simultaneously ancient and pristine. Necron construction didn't age. It simply existed, maintained at quantum levels by technology that made the Mechanicus's greatest works look like stone tools. The Silent King waited. Szarekh stood alone, his necrodermis form towering nearly as tall as Guilliman himself. The Triarch of the Necron people wore no obvious weapons, but his very presence radiated power that made the air taste of metal and mathematics. Behind him, at respectful distance, stood his Lich Guard, elite warriors who had served him for 60 million years. "Lord Commander?" Szarekh spoke, his voice resonating through quantum-entangled audio systems. "You honor this meeting with your presence." "Silent King," Guilliman replied formally. "You requested parley regarding mutual survival. I am here to listen. Not just to listen, I hope. To act, but first." Szarekh turned as another vessel descended. This one was Eldar, its wraithbone hull singing with psychic resonance. "Our third party arrives. How considerate of the Eldar to invite themselves." The Eldar vessel touched down with impossible grace. Its doors opened, and Eldrad Ulthron emerged, flanked by Farseers from multiple craft worlds. Behind them, to Guilliman's surprise, came a Dark Eldar representative, an Archon whose very presence made the air feel colder. "Eldrad Ulthron," Guilliman acknowledged. They had met before briefly during the Gathering Storm. The Farseer had provided cryptic warnings about the Inari and the awakening of their death god. Warnings that had proven frustratingly accurate. Lord Guilliman, Silent King. Eldrad bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that cost the ancient Eldar nothing and bought potential cooperation. I hope you will forgive our uninvited presence. The Black Library has opened its deepest vaults for this threat. What we learned compels us to be here. The Black Library, Szarekh said, and something in his synthetic voice suggested interest. I had thought it myth. Eldar propaganda about possessing knowledge worth protecting. It is very real, Eldrad replied, and very old. Old enough to contain records from before the War in Heaven, from the time when the Old Ones ruled this galaxy, from when they fled. That caught everyone's attention. Speak plainly, Guilliman commanded. I have brought the Imperium's full authority to this meeting. I have risked my life and violated a dozen doctrinal restrictions by treating with Xenos. Tell me it was worth it. Eldrad looked at Szarekh. You called this meeting because your people encountered these entities before. During the War in Heaven. Tell him what you know, Silent King. Tell him why the Old Ones ran. Szarekh was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 60 million years of memory. We were winning the War in Heaven. The Satan had given us power beyond comprehension. We had transformed from dying flesh into eternal metal. We were shattering the Old One's empire world by world. Victory was assured. He paused. Then something changed. The Old Ones stopped fighting. Simply stopped. Abandoned their empire. Fled through gates they'd built to dimensions we couldn't follow. We thought them cowards, Szarekh continued. We claimed victory. Began the process of exterminating their creations. Your people, Eldrad, among others. But the war's violence had torn reality open. Created wounds between the Materium and Immaterium. And through those wounds, we sense them. The outside. What are they? Guilliman asked directly. Chaos entities? Warp predators? Neither, Eldrad answered. The warp is young. Chaos is younger still. The outer gods existed before this. Universe cooled. Before matter condensed. Before the concept of gods was invented. They are fundamental. Like gravity. Like entropy. Like the passage of time itself. He gestured, and psychic images formed in the air. Impressions pulled from the Black Library's records. Guilliman saw beings that his transhuman mind struggled to process. Things that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. Entities whose forms suggested tentacles and eyes and mouths, but were none of those things. Just approximations his brain forced onto shapes it couldn't truly comprehend. They don't invade, Eldrad continued. They don't conquer. They observe. And their observation reshapes reality to accommodate their presence. Entire civilizations have been transformed into living components of their research. Populations that continue to exist, technically, but in states so alien that calling them alive is generous. The enslavers, Szarekh said suddenly. The plague that ended the War in Heaven. We thought them warp entities, but they weren't, were they? They were reality's immune system, Eldrad confirmed. The galaxy trying to reduce psychic noise before the outside noticed us. It worked, for millions of years, until my people's fall created Slaanesh, until the Great Rift split your Imperium in half, Lord Guilliman. We've been making noise again, and they've noticed. Guilliman felt something cold settle in his chest. My father knew. The Emperor. He must have known. Your Emperor is very, very old, Eldrad said carefully. Old enough to remember when humanity was young. Old enough perhaps to remember when the Old Ones still walked this galaxy. If he knew, he kept silent. Perhaps because silence was the only defense. Then speaking now endangers us further. Sicarius objected. This meeting itself is already observed. A new voice interrupted. Not spoken, not transmitted. Simply present, vibrating through the platform itself, through the pylons, through the atoms. In their bodies, everyone's weapons came up instantly. Guilliman's hand went to the Emperor's sword. Necron warriors phased into existence around Szarekh. Eldar Farseers raised psychic wards. But there was nothing to aim at. The air shimmered, reality bent, and something stepped through dimensional barriers as easily as walking through a curtain. It was almost humanoid. Almost. Tall and thin, wrapped in robes that shifted through colors that had no names. Its face, if that word applied, was a constantly changing mask that showed different features from different angles. Sometimes human, sometimes Eldar, sometimes Necron, sometimes things that had never evolved in this reality. I am called Nyarlathotep, it said, voice layered with harmonics that suggested 1,000 speakers. Though names are barely relevant, I am the crawling chaos, the messenger of those who dwell outside. And I bring greetings from my masters, who find your little conference amusing. Guilliman didn't lower the Emperor's sword. The blade burned with the power of the Man-Emperor, enough to slay greater demons. He doubted it would matter here, but it was something to hold on to. You're the entity from Terminus Sigma 17th, the one that drove the research station mad. I merely introduced them to truth. That their madness followed is not my concern. Mortal minds are so fragile, so limited. You exist in 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, and you think that's reality. How adorably myopic. What do you want? Szarekh demanded, and for the first time in 60 million years, there was something almost like fear in his voice. What? Nyarlathotep laughed, a sound like breaking glass arranged musically. I don't want anything. Want implies lack. Lack implies limitation. I exist in states where limitation is optional. But my masters have become curious about this galaxy. You've been making so much noise lately. Wars, death, suffering, the birth of gods. It's entertaining. We're not entertainment, Guilliman growled. No. Then what are you? You fight your endless wars over ideologies you barely understand. You die in billions for causes that will be forgotten. You rage against the dying of the light, as if light and darkness were meaningful distinctions. From where my masters observe, you're fascinating. Like watching bacteria develop patterns. Meaningless individually, but collectively, interesting. Eldrad stepped forward, and Guilliman noticed the Farseer's hands were shaking, almost imperceptibly. But there. If we become uninteresting, you'll leave? Eventually, Nyarlathotep confirmed. My masters experience time differently than you. Your entire civilization, from first stone tool to final collapse, is a single moment to them. But even moments can be boring if nothing novel occurs. The war in heaven was interesting. The fall of the Eldar was interesting. This great rift is very interesting. But if you settle into predictable patterns, if you stop making novel chaos, then yes, attention will drift elsewhere. How long? Szarekh asked. In your time? Centuries. Perhaps millennia. Perhaps less if something more interesting emerges elsewhere. The multiverse is infinite. There are always other realities putting on better shows. Guilliman processed this. You're saying our survival depends on becoming boring, on creating stability, peace. Peace is incredibly boring, Nyarlathotep agreed cheerfully. Cooperation is tedious. Unity is dull. If your 3 species could actually work together, truly work together, not just tactical alliances, but fundamental cooperation, you'd become background noise, static, something to ignore while we watch more entertaining realities. Is that possible? For Imperium, Necrons, and Eldar to forge lasting peace? The silence was absolute. Then Guilliman spoke, voice carrying absolute conviction. Yes. Every head turned toward him. Szarekh looked shocked. The Necrons seemed skeptical. Even Eldrad raised an eyebrow. My father built the Imperium on pragmatism, Guilliman continued. He made treaties when necessary, used Xenos technology when it served humanity. It was only after the heresy, after I fell, that the Imperium became this theological nightmare that values purity over survival. But I am awake now, and I have the authority to make treaties in the Emperor's name. He looked at Szarekh. You ruled your people before they became machines. You remember what it was to be mortal, to fear death, to hope for better. That's why you sought biotransference, not from evil, but from desperation. I understand desperation. Then to Eldrad. Your people nearly destroyed the galaxy through excess. You learned, you survived, you adapted. You've spent millions of years clinging to existence against impossible odds. That takes wisdom I cannot match. I am barely 11,000 years old. You were ancient when my species was learning to make fire. What are you proposing? Eldrad asked carefully. A treaty, a real one. Not an alliance of convenience, but a fundamental restructuring of how we interact. Shared intelligence on threats, agreed upon borders, trade, if possible. Joint defense against chaos, against tyrannids, against anything that threatens extinction. He gestured at the ruins of Cadia floating around them. This world died because we couldn't cooperate. Because Imperium and Eldar and Necrons all fought separately, while chaos picked us off one by one. How many more worlds have to die before we learn? The Imperium will never accept this, Szarekh said quietly. The Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, half the High Lords? Then I will make them accept it, Guilliman interrupted. I am the Lord Commander. I speak with the Emperor's authority, and if anyone objects, they can take it up with my father. If he disagrees, he can tell me himself. But until he does, I will do what must be done to ensure humanity survives. Szarekh studied the Primarch with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of stars. You would risk civil war for this. Your Imperium would tear itself apart. It's already tearing itself apart, Guilliman replied. The Great Rift split us in two. Chaos is ascendant. And now something worse is watching. If civil war is the price of survival, so be it. But I hope, that enough of the Imperium will see reason when shown the alternative. He turned back to Nyarlathotep. Tell your masters we accept their challenge. We will become boring. So tediously, frustratingly boring that you'll find other realities to watch. But know this. Humanity has survived 10,000 years of the worst the galaxy could throw at us. We will survive you too, not through defeating you, but by being too stubborn to stay interesting. Nyarlathotep's mask seemed to smile. Bold words. We shall see if you can back them up. My masters will watch and wait. And if you succeed in becoming truly boring, well, that would itself be interesting. A paradox worth observing. The entity began to fade, reality reasserting itself where it had been standing. Oh, and Lord Commander, your Emperor sends his regards. He's been waiting for you to figure this out for quite some time. He's very proud of you. Then it was gone. Guilliman stood frozen. His father had sent a message through that thing. His mind reeled at the implications. Was it telling the truth? He asked Eldrad. The Farseers' ancient eyes were unreadable. About the Emperor, I cannot say. But about everything else? Yes, I felt no deception. These entities are beyond lying. Truth and falsehood are equally meaningless to them. Szarekh's laugh was bitter and synthetic. Then we have our answer. The only path to survival is cooperation between species who have been killing each other for millions of years. The gods must find that hilarious. Then let's give them the worst comedy they've ever seen, Guilliman said. Let's forge a peace so dull, so bureaucratic, so mind-numbingly stable that even cosmic horrors change the channel. Who's with me? The silence stretched. Then Eldrad raised one hand. The Farseers of Ulthwé will support this. We have seen too many futures end in extinction. If cooperation offers even a chance of survival, we must take it. Szarekh looked at his Lich Guard, at the tomb ships hanging in orbit, at the galaxy he'd once ruled and damned. The Silent King agrees. Let it be known across all dynasties. The Necrons will honor this treaty, for now, until survival is assured or extinction makes it irrelevant. Guilliman nodded slowly. Then we begin. Here, now, on the grave of a world that died because we wouldn't work together. We start drafting terms, establishing protocols, making ourselves so boringly efficient that the cosmos forgets we exist. He looked up at the impossible city floating in Cadia's ruins, where the king in yellow watched from his throne of angles. And we pray that boredom is enough. The treaty took 6 solar weeks to draft. 6 weeks of negotiations that would have been impossible under any other circumstances. 6 weeks while reality itself continued to fray at the edges and populations across the galaxy descended into incomprehensible madness. But the impossible was happening. Guilliman established a permanent delegation aboard a reconfigured space station at the Cadian coordinates. Neutral ground maintained by Necron pylons, warded by Eldar runes, and blessed by the Mechanicus. Representatives from all 3 powers worked in shifts, hammering out details that ranged from the profound to the absurdly practical. Border definitions, trade protocols, shared intelligence on chaos incursions, joint defense pacts against Tyranid hive fleets, technology exchange agreements, carefully worded to prevent either side from gaining overwhelming advantage while still allowing mutual benefit. Rules of engagement when forces encountered each other in contested space. Dispute resolution mechanisms that didn't default to immediate warfare. It was bureaucracy on a galactic scale. Tedious, exhausting, painfully, deliberately boring. And it was working. The reports from across the galaxy showed the pattern. In sectors where the treaty was being implemented, where Imperium, Necron, and Eldar forces actually cooperated instead of fighting, the reality fractures were stabilizing. The madness cults were declining. The population transformations were slowing, not stopping, but slowing. It's working because we're becoming predictable, Eldrad explained during one negotiating session. The outside finds novelty interesting. War is novel. Betrayal is novel. Cooperation between ancient enemies? That was novel too for about 3 weeks. Now it's routine. Paperwork, trade agreements, border patrols. It's the most boring thing we could possibly do, and it's saving us. But not everyone was pleased. On Terra, the news of Guilliman's treaty had caused immediate uproar. The Ecclesiarch declared it heresy. The master of the Administratum claimed it violated 17,000 years of Imperial doctrine. 3 High Lords resigned in protest. The Inquisition split down the middle, half supporting Guilliman's pragmatism, half preparing to declare him traitor. Only the Fabricator General of Mars supported it without reservation. The Mechanicus, ever pragmatic, saw the technological exchange possibilities and jumped aboard immediately. "My lord," Captain Sicarius reported, "we're receiving word from Terra. The High Lords are demanding you return to answer charges of..." "It's a long list, my lord. Consorting with Xenos, violating the Emperor's doctrine, heresy against the Imperial creed. They're threatening to declare you excommunicate traitors. Guilliman didn't look up from the treaty document he was reviewing. Tell them I'll return when the galaxy isn't ending. Until then, they can file their complaints in triplicate and wait for my secretary to get back to them. You don't have a secretary, my lord. Exactly. Guilliman signed the document and handed it to a Necron cryptech for verification. How many sectors have implemented the cooperation protocols? 17 fully operational, 43 in transition, another 100 waiting for approval from their regional commanders. Szarekh paused. The resistance is strongest in the ecclesiarchy-controlled sectors. They're refusing to acknowledge Xenos forces as anything but enemies. Then they'll learn the hard way when reality starts unraveling around them, Guilliman said coldly. I don't have time for religious zealotry, not when extinction is the alternative. But the greatest resistance came from an unexpected source. Abaddon the Despoiler. The War Master of Chaos had watched the treaty negotiations with growing rage. The Great Rift was his triumph. The galaxy splitting in half was his victory. He had spent 10,000 years orchestrating Cadia's fall, opening the largest warp breach in history, bringing chaos to ascendancy. And now the corpse worshippers, soul-stealing Xenos, and soulless machines were cooperating, creating stability, making themselves boring to entities that even the Chaos Gods feared. Unacceptable. The Black Legion fleet translated from warp space at the edge of the Cadian system with overwhelming force. 50 capital ships, hundreds of escorts, demon engines that screamed reality apart just by existing. And at their center, the Vengeful Spirit, Abaddon's flagship, the same vessel Horus had commanded during the heresy. Lord Commander, Szarekh reported, voice tight. Black Legion, full assault formation. They're broadcasting on all frequencies. Abaddon demands you face him in single combat, or he'll reduce every ship in this system to atoms. Guilliman stood slowly. Around him, the negotiation chamber emptied as representatives rushed to their ships. Battle stations were called, weapons powered up. The fragile peace was about to be tested by the one force that thrived on chaos. Acknowledge his challenge, Guilliman commanded. Tell him I accept, but not in space. On Cadia's surface, on neutral ground, in sight of the King in Yellow City. My lord, that's strategic, Guilliman interrupted. Abaddon wants to disrupt our cooperation by killing me. Fine. But he'll do it under the observation of entities that find conflict interesting. Let's see if the Despoiler is willing to entertain cosmic horrors just to satisfy his pride. The message went out. For 17 seconds, there was no response. Then Abaddon's reply came through, his voice carrying 10,000 years of hatred. Agreed. I will kill you where the gods can watch, Guilliman. Where your corpse father can witness his last loyal son fall. Where the Xenos you've allied with can see the price of trusting the Imperium. I'm coming down. The landing site was the same platform where the treaty negotiations had begun. Necron pylons hummed with power, maintaining stable reality. Eldar wards glowed with psychic energy, preventing demonic intrusion. And above it all, the impossible city of the King in Yellow watched with eternal patience. Guilliman descended alone. No honor guard, no weapons beyond the Emperor's sword and the hand of Dominion. If this was to be single combat, he would honor it. Abaddon arrived in a drop pod that screamed through the atmosphere like a demon, trailing warp fire and corruption. When it hit the platform, the door exploded outward in a shower of molten metal. The Despoiler emerged. He was massive, nearly as tall as Guilliman, armored in the same suit he'd worn for 10 millennia. Terminator plate corrupted by chaos, decorated with trophies from 10,000 battles. The talon of Horus on one arm, the same weapon that had struck down the Emperor. Drachnyen, in the other hand, a demon blade that had wounded the Emperor during the siege of Terra. "Guilliman," Abaddon's voice was thunder. "How far you've fallen. From Lord of Ultramar to Xenos lover. Your father would weep if he had tears left." "My father would do what was necessary to ensure humanity's survival," Guilliman replied evenly. "As I am doing, as you've forgotten how to do. You serve chaos now, Ezekiel. You've become a slave to the very powers that destroyed our Imperium." "I serve no one," Abaddon roared. "I use chaos. I command it. I am the War Master, and I have brought the galaxy to its knees." "You've brought it to the attention of things that make chaos look like children playing with matches," Guilliman corrected. "And now you're disrupting the only strategy that might save us. So yes, I'll fight you. But know this. If you kill me, the treaty continues. If I kill you, chaos loses its greatest champion. Either way, cooperation wins. Your attack has already failed." Abaddon's response was to charge. The despoiler moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible in Terminator armor, enhanced by 10,000 years of chaos empowerment. Drachnyen screamed as it cut toward Guilliman's head, the demon blade hungry for Primarch blood. Guilliman parried with the Emperor's sword. Where the two blades met, reality cracked. Holy fire clashed with demonic hunger. The platform beneath them shattered, Necron construction breaking under the strain of forces it wasn't designed to contain. They fought like gods. Guilliman's transhuman speed against Abaddon's chaos-enhanced ferocity. The Emperor's sword against the blade that had wounded him. Tactical genius against 10 millennia of hatred distilled into martial perfection. Around them, fleets held their fire. This was between champions now, between the Imperium's Lord Commander and Chaos's greatest warlord. But something was changing. The king in Yellow's city was moving closer. Not physically, it remained fixed in Cadia's ruins. But dimensionally, it was approaching. The angles were shifting. Reality was bending to bring the city into closer observation of the combat. And with it came presence, awareness, attention from things that existed outside the galaxy's conventional space-time. Guilliman felt it like ice in his veins, a sensation of being watched by eyes that existed in dimensions he couldn't perceive, of being studied, documented, analyzed by intellects that operated on scales that made his own genius look like an ant contemplating mathematics. Abaddon felt it too. The despoiler's attacks became more frenzied, more desperate. Because even someone who'd spent 10,000 years serving chaos could recognize when something worse was paying attention. "They're watching," Guilliman said between strikes. "The entities that make even the chaos gods afraid. They find our conflict entertaining. Every blow we strike, every drop of blood we shed, makes us more interesting to them. Is that what you want, Ezekiel? To be a show for cosmic horrors?" "I want you dead," Abaddon roared. But there was something in his voice now. Something that might have been doubt. "Then kill me," Guilliman challenged. "Strike me down. Prove your strength. And know that in doing so, you'll be performing exactly as they expect. You'll be following the script they've written. You'll be entertainment." He lowered the Emperor's sword slightly. Not much, just enough to be noticeable. "Or," Guilliman continued, "you could walk away, refuse to give them their show, prove that even you, War Master of Chaos, Despoiler of Worlds, won't dance when cosmic horrors play their music. Prove you still have free will." Abaddon froze. Drachnyen raised for a killing blow. For 17 seconds, the War Master of Chaos stood motionless. Around them, fleets watched. Below them, the Necron pylons hummed. Above them, the impossible city waited. Then Abaddon laughed. It was a terrible sound, bitter and broken, and somehow triumphant. "You're right," the despoiler said quietly. "We're dancing to their tune. Fighting because that's what they expect. Killing because it's interesting." He lowered Drachnian. "I have spent 10,000 years refusing to serve, refusing to kneel. The Chaos Gods think I'm their champion, but I command them as much as they command me, and I will not perform for things that regard even gods as entertainment." He stepped back, slowly, deliberately. "This isn't over, Guilliman. Our war continues. The Imperium will fall. Your false emperor will die. But not today. Not because they want to watch. When I kill you, it will be on my terms, not theirs." Abaddon activated his teleportarium. As warp energy surrounded him, he spoke one final line. "Tell your Xenos allies this. Even chaos has pride. Even damnation has dignity, and we will not perform for an audience that sees us as bacteria." He vanished. The Black Legion fleet began retreating, pulling back from the system without firing a shot. On every ship, Imperium, Necron, Eldar, crews watched in stunned silence as chaos itself withdrew rather than provide entertainment for the outside. Guilliman stood alone on the shattered platform, Emperor's sword still ignited, and felt something he hadn't felt since awakening from stasis. Hope. If even Abaddon could recognize the danger, if even the War Master of Chaos could choose dignity over spectacle, then perhaps, just perhaps, the galaxy could survive this. "Lord Commander?" Eldrad's voice came through his vox. The Farseer had been watching from orbit. "What just happened?" "Something impossible," Guilliman replied. "Abaddon chose boredom over glory, chose irrelevance over interest. He just proved that survival matters more than pride, even to chaos. Will he honor it? For now, while the outside watches, which gives us time." Guilliman looked up at the impossible city. Time to make ourselves so tediously stable that even cosmic horrors get bored and leave. But as he returned to his Thunderhawk, Guilliman felt the weight of what had almost happened. They'd come within seconds of giving the outside exactly what it wanted. Conflict, drama, the death of a Primarch at the hands of Chaos's greatest champion. And they'd refused. Collectively, consciously. For the first time since the Great Rift opened, the galaxy had chosen boring stability over interesting conflict. It was the most revolutionary act any of them had ever committed. The transformation took years, but the galaxy's survival was measured in decades of determined tedium. Across Imperial space, a new doctrine emerged, not from Terra, but from Guilliman's tireless enforcement. The Codex Xenorelatus, as the Mechanicus named it. Rules for engagement with Necron tomb worlds. Protocols for coordinating with Eldar Corsairs against Tyrannid splinter fleets. Bureaucratic frameworks so mind-numbingly comprehensive that even the Administratum complained about excessive paperwork. The Ecclesiarchy howled. 3 cardinals declared schism. The Inquisition fractured into competing factions, half supporting Guilliman's pragmatism, half preparing for civil war. But the Lord Commander held firm, backed by an unlikely coalition, the Mechanicus, seduced by technology exchange, the Space Marines, who understood tactical necessity, and increasingly, the common Imperial citizens who simply wanted to survive. On Necron tomb worlds, Cryptex began the slow process of awakening dynasties with a message that would have been incomprehensible a decade earlier. The galaxy requires cooperation, not conquest. The Silent King commands it. Some dynasties rebelled. The Maynarch dynasty launched immediate attacks on nearby human worlds. The Nechthys dynasty refused all diplomatic contact. But Szarekh was patient, and patient beings who'd waited 60 million years could wait longer. Rebellious dynasties found themselves isolated, their dolmen gates sealed, their tomb worlds surrounded by combined Imperium Eldar task forces that simply waited them out. Eventually, even the proudest Necron lords recognized reality. The Infinite Empire was gone. What remained was survival through cooperation or extinction through pride. Most chose survival. The Eldar were perhaps the most adaptable. They had survived their fall through flexibility and cunning. Adding cooperation with Mon-Ki and undead machines to their survival strategies was merely another adaptation. The craft worlds established trade routes through Imperial space. Wraithbone for agricultural products, psychic training for navigator houses, Eldar Farseers consulting on chaos corruption in exchange for protection of maiden worlds. The Dark Eldar were harder to convince. Vect initially refused all contact, preferring Kamara's isolation. But when reality fractures began appearing even in the webway, when the outside's attention proved capable of reaching even their hidden city, pragmatism won. Limited trade, intelligence sharing on chaos movements, an agreement to stop raiding Imperial worlds in exchange for the Imperium providing other sources of suffering. Criminal worlds, chaos cultist strongholds, enemies that needed elimination anyway. It was ugly, morally compromised, exactly the kind of devil's bargain that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. But it was boring, predictable, routine. And slowly, sector by sector, the madness began to recede. The cults, worshipping incomprehensible geometries, found themselves isolated, their viral madness contained through coordinated quarantine. Necron pylons suppressed the reality fractures. Eldar Farseers guided evacuation efforts. Imperial Guard established perimeters. Working together, they could save worlds that would have been lost fighting separately. The transformation wasn't complete. Entire sectors remained infected, populations too far gone to save. The impossible cities didn't vanish. They remained, hanging in orbit around dead worlds, monuments to what had almost consumed everything. The King in Yellow still sat on his throne above Cadia, watching with eternal patience. But the spread had stopped. "We're becoming background noise," Eldrad reported during one of the regular council meetings that now occurred monthly. The gathering had become routine. Guilliman, Szarekh, Eldrad, representatives from a dozen factions, all sitting in the same chamber reviewing trade disputes and border violations and supply chain logistics. My Farseers report that the outside's attention is drifting, not gone, but less focused. We're becoming predictable, boring. "How long until they lose interest entirely?" Szarekh asked. "Impossible to calculate precisely. Time operates differently for them. But if we maintain current stability, centuries, maybe millennia. Long enough for new generations to be born who've never known anything except cooperation. Long enough that this becomes normal." Guilliman reviewed the latest reports. Tyrannid hive fleets being repelled by combined arms, Necron Gauss weapons, Eldar psychic coordination, Imperial Guard massed fire. Chaos incursions met with unified response, making each individual incursion too costly to sustain. The Great Rift still split the galaxy, but stable corridors had been established through it, allowing communication and transport between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. The galaxy was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. "We've done something unprecedented," Guilliman said quietly. 3 species that have been killing each other for millennia, working together, not because we suddenly like each other, but because survival demanded it. "The Imperium will never forgive you," Szarekh observed. "In their history books, you'll be remembered as the Primarch who betrayed everything your father built." "My father built pragmatism," Guilliman corrected. "The Imperium that came after, the theocratic nightmare that worships him as a god. That's not what he wanted. If he disapproves, he can tell me himself when this is over. And if these entities return? Eldrad asked. If we become interesting again? Then we'll face it together, Guilliman replied. We've proven it's possible. We've created frameworks, protocols, relationships that can be reactivated. We've shown that survival matters more than pride. But the greatest test came not from outside, but from within. On Terra, the Ecclesiarch finally made his move. Basileus XLIII declared Guilliman excommunicate traitorous, a heretic who had violated the Emperor's sacred doctrine. He called for a crusade, not against Xenos or Chaos, but against the Lord Commander himself. 3 Space Marine chapters answered the call, along with 17 full Astra Militarum regiments and a portion of the Sisters of Battle. The fleet that translated into the Cadian system carried enough firepower to level continents. But they found something unexpected. Guilliman's fleet, Necron tomb ships, Eldar craft world vessels, all arrayed in defensive formation, but weapons cold. No aggression, just presence. This is Chapter Master Kovash of the Black Templars. The Vox crackled. We have come for the traitor Roboute Guilliman. Surrender him immediately, or face the Emperor's wrath. Guilliman himself responded. Brother Kovash, I understand your anger, your confusion. You believe I've betrayed everything we stand for. But I ask you, come down, to the surface. Meet with me, with the Xenos I've allied with. See what we've accomplished. Then decide if I'm a traitor. You consort with Xenos? You've abandoned the Emperor's light. I've saved 1,700 Imperial worlds, Guilliman replied calmly. Worlds that would have been lost to entities that make chaos look like a mild inconvenience. Come down, see the data. Make an informed decision. If, after reviewing everything, you still believe I'm a traitor, I will submit to judgment. I give you my word as a Primarch. The silence stretched for 3 minutes. Then, we're coming down. But know this, Guilliman. If you've deceived us, no force in the galaxy will save you. The meeting took place in the same chamber where the treaty had been negotiated. Guilliman presented everything. The reports from Inquisitor Mordred, the Black Library's records, Necron historical data from the War in Heaven, video documentation of the reality fractures, testimonials from hundreds of planetary governors whose worlds had been saved through cooperation. And critically, he showed them the cities, the impossible structures that still floated in the void, monuments to what had almost consumed them. Showed them populations that had been transformed, minds replaced with something incomprehensible. This is what we faced, Guilliman said quietly. Not chaos, not Xenos. Something older, something that regards even gods as temporary phenomena. Something that was reshaping reality itself through mere observation. And the only defense, was to make ourselves too boring to watch. Chapter Master Kovash studied the data for hours. His chaplains reviewed the theological implications. His tech marines verified the technical documentation. Finally, he removed his helmet, a gesture of vulnerability among space marines. I fought beside you during the Indomitus Crusade, Kovash said quietly. I know your loyalty. I know your faith. But this, he gestured at the chamber, at the Xenos representatives, at everything it represented. This violates everything I was taught, everything I believe. I know, Guilliman replied. It violates everything I believe too. But the alternative was extinction, not defeat, not corruption, extinction. The complete erasure of everything that makes us human, everything that makes us alive. So I chose pragmatism over purity, survival over dogma. If that makes me a traitor, so be it. Kovash looked at his battle brothers, at the 3 chapters that had come to arrest a Primarch, then back to Guilliman. "The Emperor protects," he said finally. "But perhaps he protects through unexpected means, through alliances we don't want to accept, through choices that feel like betrayal but lead to survival." He knelt, slowly, armored knees striking the deck. "I will not arrest you, Lord Commander. I will not call you traitor. But I cannot support you either. I will return to Terra, report what I've seen. Let the Imperium decide. That's all I ask," Guilliman said. "Truth, honest evaluation, not blind dogma." The Crusade fleet departed without firing a shot. And while they hadn't endorsed Guilliman's actions, they hadn't opposed them either. It was a kind of victory, small, uncertain, but real. Over the following decades, the pattern repeated across the galaxy. Some factions embraced cooperation, some rejected it violently. But slowly, gradually, the weight of evidence became undeniable. Working together saved worlds. Fighting separately condemned them. And the outside? The outside grew bored. The impossible cities remained, but dormant. The reality fractures stabilized, becoming tourist attractions for the morbidly curious. Places where you could see geometry that shouldn't exist, contained safely behind Necron barrier fields. The King in Yellow sat on his throne above Cadia, but silent, patient, waiting for the galaxy to become interesting again, waiting for the show to resume. But the galaxy refused to perform. Trade routes, border disputes, diplomatic negotiations, technology exchange programs, cultural exchange carefully monitored, joint military exercises, all the boring machinery of civilization, running with bureaucratic efficiency that would have made the Administratum proud. Guilliman stood in his private chambers aboard the Macraga's Honor, reviewing the latest reports. 200 years had passed since the treaty. 200 years of careful, deliberate stability. He looked older now. Primarchs aged slowly, but age was visible in the weight behind his eyes. "Lord Commander?" Szarekh entered. His captain had aged too, served faithfully through 2 centuries of change. Final report from the Farseer Council. The outside's attention has shifted. They're observing other realities now, other dimensions. We've become uninteresting. Guilliman nodded slowly. Then we've won, not through defeating them, but by refusing to be worth defeating. Is it truly victory if we had to change everything we were to achieve it? We didn't change what we were, Guilliman corrected. We changed what we prioritized. Humanity still exists, still struggles, still dreams. We just do it alongside Xenos, who also want to exist, struggle, and dream. That's not betrayal. That's evolution. He looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Emperor sat on his golden throne, silent as ever. Whether he approved or disapproved, Guilliman would never know. But he'd made his choice. Had saved the galaxy through pragmatism, compromise, and the deliberate cultivation of tedium. It was perhaps the least glorious victory in Imperial history, but it was victory nonetheless. "Come," Guilliman said to Szarekh. "We have a trade negotiation with the Sautek dynasty in 3 hours. Something about disputed mining rights on 17 asteroid clusters. Terribly boring. Exactly how I wanted." Szarekh smiled slightly. "The Lord Commander saves the galaxy through paperwork. Future generations will never believe it. Future generations will have the luxury of not believing it because they'll be alive to disbelieve," Guilliman replied. "That's enough for me." They left the chamber, heading toward another meeting, another negotiation, another increment of stability in a galaxy that had learned, slowly, painfully, that survival sometimes required setting aside pride, doctrine, and ancient hatreds in favor of something far more powerful. Cooperation so mundane, it bored cosmic horrors into looking elsewhere for entertainment. The galaxy remembers the Great Convergence differently depending on who tells the story. The Imperium's official histories call it the time of necessary compromise, when Lord Commander Guilliman made difficult choices to preserve humanity. The ecclesiarchy still argues whether it was heresy or divine inspiration. Most citizens don't care. They remember it as the time when the madness stopped, when reality stabilized, when cooperation between ancient enemies became normal. The Necrons record it as the Second Silence, the era when they learned the lessons of the war in heaven and chose survival over empire. Szarekh is remembered as the Silent King who spoke at the right moment, who recognized that pride was a luxury species facing extinction couldn't afford. The Eldar weave it into their myths as the boring salvation, sung by harlequins as a comedy about cosmic horrors defeated through bureaucracy. They remember Eldrad's wisdom in opening the Black Library, in sharing knowledge that should have stayed hidden but proved necessary. None of them speak of it as victory. How could they? They hadn't defeated the outer gods, hadn't banished them, hadn't even fought them meaningfully. They had simply become too tedious to watch. And in becoming tedious, they had saved everything that mattered. The impossible cities still float in the void, monuments to what almost was. The king in yellow still sits his throne above Cadia, patient and eternal. The outside still exists in the spaces between dimensions, vast and incomprehensible and utterly indifferent. But the galaxy lives, continues, evolves. Humanity spreads to new worlds, now sometimes alongside Necron dynasties awakening from stasis. Eldar craft worlds seeking maiden worlds, all navigating relationships that would have been unthinkable generations earlier. They still fight sometimes. Old hatreds don't disappear overnight. But they fight less, cooperate more, build frameworks for resolving disputes without galactic warfare. It's not paradise, not even peace, really. Just stability. The kind of boring, predictable stability that keeps cosmic horrors from paying too much attention. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson the galaxy learned. Sometimes survival doesn't come from glory or heroism or faith. Sometimes it comes from choosing the boring option, from doing the tedious work of cooperation, from being so aggressively mundane that even entities who predate existence itself lose interest and look elsewhere. In the throne room on Terra, the God Emperor remains silent, his psychic emanation still blazing across the galaxy, guiding ships through the warp. If he approves of what his son accomplished, he doesn't say. Perhaps he's pleased. Perhaps he always knew this day would come. Perhaps he's been waiting 60,000 years for humanity to learn what the old ones learned. That sometimes running, hiding, and boring your enemies to death is the only victory possible against things that exist beyond victory and defeat. Or perhaps he's just waiting, like the outside. Patient, eternal, watching to see what happens next. Because the galaxy hasn't ended its story. It's just entered a new chapter. One written in trade agreements, diplomatic protocols, and joint military exercises. One where ancient enemies work together not because they want to, but because they must. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, the outer gods watch other realities now. Other universes putting on better shows. Other civilizations being more interesting, more dramatic, more worthy of attention. The 41st millennium had learned its lesson. Survival, in the end, belonged to the boring.